The Washington Post newsroom delivers breaking events around the world as they happen. Unrivaled reporting from the journalists you've come to trust. To get the facts fast and meet the challenges of today head on. Get the news that matters most with a special offer by visiting WashingtonPost.com/watch. Subscribing unlocks instant access, bringing you the Post's award-winning coverage anytime, any place. Because democracy dies in darkness.
War in the Middle East. Today is the fourth day of fighting between Israel and Hamas. More than 1,700 people reported killed, at least 11 of them American. President Joe Biden is expected to speak shortly against this backdrop of bloodshed threatening to swallow up an entire region. Welcome to this special report from the newsroom of the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey. I'm joined this afternoon by Olivier Knox, national political correspondent and author of The Daily 202, and Rhonda Colvin, senior politics correspondent. Thank you so much to both of you for being here. We also have a number of colleagues who are reporting from Israel, and one of us joins us live now. John Gerberg and our colleague Zoanne Murphy are video journalists, and they have been on the road today. John, thank you so much for joining us. I especially appreciate it after what I know has been a difficult reporting day. Earlier, you traveled to Kfar Aza, an Israeli community that's close to Gaza, where there's been intense fighting. Can you tell us what you've seen today?
Sure, Libby. Thanks. It's good to be with you. Like you mentioned, our colleague Zoanne Murphy and I were able to join an Israeli military convoy to the small civilian village of Kfar Aza, just a couple miles from the border with Gaza. You can see Gaza, the fence and the buildings, just over a big open field from this small community. So we were able to drive up with a military convoy, and as soon as we got into the village, even the road on the way in was lined with bullet-riddled cars, some burned out, and you started to kind of see bodies lining the road on the way in. And once we got into the village specifically, it was really striking. Not only were most homes, some bombed, some window shattered, some packed with bullet holes, but there were corpses lining the streets, corpses still in buildings. It was a mix of fighters, Hamas fighters who had been able to penetrate the village, and even some civilian corpses as well. I don't have an exact number, but there were definitely dozens, probably scores of bodies that we saw with our own eyes today. The Israelis were working on taking them out home by home in body bags, but they had a lot of work cut out for them today.
John, did you get a sense the soldiers were treating the bodies of Israeli civilians differently than the bodies of the Hamas fighters?
Yeah, I mean, sure, there's no real easy way to say that, but clearly the bodies that were left out in the streets, while there were a few civilian bodies clear civilian bodies, you could tell by the clothes and sometimes the age of these people, but the Israelis were clearly getting the civilians out of the home and putting them in bags, where the vast majority of bodies that were still just lying out prone in the streets were of fighters.
What did the Israeli soldiers tell you about how they're doing and what's going on?
Sure. We've talked to a number of soldiers. One who I interviewed today, his name is Yonatan, and he's from a small village in Israel, but he was actually on vacation in Los Angeles when the attack happened. He's still an active soldier, and he said, but he was just on vacation. He said he immediately, him and his brother, both active, flew back immediately, and they were on patrol today. And he was, empty-eyed and struggling for words. He said this is something he never dreamed of. He's been prepared for wars. He's seen conflict here his whole life, but especially for Israelis, to see something penetrate their side of the conflict. I think they're used to having a conflict near, but not on their home turf in a way. And there's a certain, complacency, I think, that you can settle into after many, many years of that. But to see it so vividly in his own country and among people he considers, his own community, was something he was very much still processing, really struggling to even put it into words. But he said, I can't believe what happened to my country. This changes everything. We'll be fighting for a long time. And, the heartbreak and just a sense of loss was staggering.
John, I hear you saying that that soldier thinks that this is going to go on for a long time. Did you talk to any civilians, and do you have a sense of what the people are anticipating happens next?
Sure. I mean, everybody's, really on edge and doesn't know exactly what's going to happen next. I mean, we've seen conflicts here, and I've covered conflicts here that have flared up and gone away in a matter of days, and I've covered conflicts here that have gone on for months. I don't think anybody expects this to taper down that quickly. I mean, in a matter of days. People, I think, are hoping for the best, but a lot of other Israelis, non-soldiers that I've talked to, are also just in a state of shock, in the sense that, Libby, if you go to the border areas where we were today, you look up, you see communications towers, you see barbed wire and walls and military bases, and the level of military infrastructure and surveillance security infrastructure that Israel, by the way, prides itself in and is looked to throughout the world as a kind of, leader and purveyor in this kind of technology, that seems to fail them. Israeli citizens expect all of that to serve to protect them 24/7 their entire lives. And clearly, despite the vast amounts of money and human resources that have gone into turning this and, militarizing these borders, it has not saved hundreds of Israelis now. So I think the shock, the letdown, the almost, I can't speak for people as far, but I think there's almost a sense of, not of betrayal exactly, but of an expectation of security that is just lost. And I don't think that's something that you can get back very easily after something this tragic.
That's John Gerberg, video journalist with the Washington Post, traveling with our colleague Zoanne Murphy. Thank you so much, John. Please stay safe. Olivier, I want you to give us some perspective on this and the scale of what happened, the shock that John's talking about, the surprise of this attack, but also how cataclysmic this could be for the region.
Sure. So this is a surprise attack of unparalleled sophistication and scale by Hamas. John was alluding to the shock of long-standing Israeli defenses having been breached, having been punctured so ruthlessly and efficiently by Hamas. We are still finding out details of what Hamas fighters did in these various Israeli settlements on Israeli bases, of course. The obvious reference that everyone's throwing around is 9/11, sort of similar thing where something came out of the blue. Obviously, Israel knew that Hamas was deeply hostile to them, wants to wipe them off the map and the rest of it. But the idea that they would breach the defenses so completely and carry out such a massacre of Israelis with relatively little response from Israeli intelligence and the military. It's a moment of national trauma that could actually turn very easily into a broader regional conflagration in a couple different ways. Hamas is just one of the groups that Iran supports. Lebanese Hezbollah is another. Now they've been firing rockets into northern Israel, but so far we haven't seen a will to carry out a significantly larger operation. But if they did, that would become a regional conflict. You can hear in President Biden words and the words from other White House officials and Pentagon officials, that's top of mind for them. They're very concerned. They moved an aircraft carrier group to the Eastern Mediterranean to deter exactly that from happening. That's one of the ways that this could go south. We have to talk about the fact that Israel, the language that Israel is using about wiping out Hamas and the rest of it, really does point in the general direction of a ground offensive in Gaza, with all the potential dangers of that for the Gazan people, of course, for the Israeli Defense Forces, and for others. So this could very easily get a lot worse.
We'll talk more about what we expect from President Biden today. Rhonda, fill us in on the congressional part of this picture. Frankly, Congress, the Republicans in particular in the House, have been a mess, and they've been so embroiled in their own intra-party politics. Are they able to refocus right now and deal with this crisis in front of them?
I think we're going to see where the focus is over the next day or two, specifically because they will start the process of electing a new speaker starting tonight in a closed-door session. But overall, what we are hearing from members is that this did sort of change the tone a little bit. One thing that you might see Congress do in the short term is a resolution that's being pushed by the top Republican and top Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. They want to put forward a resolution and pass it by unanimous consent if they don't have a speaker in a few days that would condemn the attack, and it would also point the finger at Iran, which is really notable because the State Department has been handling that question delicately about how Iran might have been involved in helping coordinate this attack. So that is a resolution we might see in the short term. We're also hearing from the House Foreign Affairs Committee that they want to start moving forward and pass some of the tensions in the House GOP and to start packages of aid funded specifically for the Iron Dome, the air missile defense system.
I want to talk more about that with you in a moment, but let's bring in Tolu Olorunipa, our White House bureau chief. Tolu, tell us what we know about how President Biden is going into these remarks.
Well, he has a very difficult balance to try to strike. He obviously wants to show support for Israel. The commentary that we've heard from him and from his White House aides over the past couple of days has been very supportive of Israel, calling this a terrorist attack. Saying that the United States' support for Israel is unwavering and steadfast. But at the same time, he wants to put forward the idea that we don't want this to become a broader war. We don't want other countries to get involved, other parties hostile to Israel to get involved. And the subtext of that is that we don't want Israel to take any actions that could lead to kinds of humanitarian crises taking place and being broadcast for the world to see in the Gaza Strip. And so while we've heard reporting that in his calls with Prime Minister Netanyahu, he hasn't called for Israel to show restraint, I do think that's going to be some of the subtext of what we hear because the president is the president of the United States, and he obviously has to care about potential hostages that are in the Gaza Strip, but he also has to think about what's happening as a leader of the free world and making sure that his presidency isn't marked by a broader war in the Middle East that brings in a number of different countries and a number of different forces. And so he has to calibrate his language in a way to make sure that he shows support for Israel, but doesn't sound like he's supporting a broader war, not only with Israel and Hamas, but also a number of different countries and a number of different parties that could be watching very closely to listen to his words.
Tolu, how much pressure and weight is on President Biden in a moment like this, and the U.S. in general, in terms of playing a role here?
Well, there's a lot of pressure on the president. Not only does he have to think about international diplomacy, he has to think about domestic politics. There's already a war happening in Europe with Ukraine and with Russia aggressively going after territory in Ukraine, and that has marked a good chunk of his presidency. And the wariness of the American public has also been increasing over that war. And so the idea that more, American tax dollars, more support could be going to another war is something that could spark some wariness among the public, and also questioning the president's broader international diplomacy and his approach to international relations. If we're seeing wars pop up, if we're seeing multiple different places at war, it does call into question, how the president has led on the world stage. And so he has to not only show support for Israel, but also show that he has a global vision for how he's going to bring peace to a number of different places that are currently struggling.
Olivier, let's talk about the relationship that Biden has with some of the important people in this moment, primarily Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, but also other leaders who could have some influence or some say in this.
Right. Well, the relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu has been fraught for a while. These two men have known each other for a very, very long time. But as you know, the relationship between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Obama White House was quite poor, quite tense. While the relationship between American and Israeli security apparatus, the military, intelligence, the rest, has always been excellent, the political leadership has not always seen eye to eye. There was a trip that Biden went on to Israel as vice president when Netanyahu was seen as humiliating him by announcing the expansion of settlements. Biden on that trip turned down his aide's advice to leave the country early. But it is a tense relationship. One of the things we've seen in the last couple of days, though, is we've seen Biden do a joint phone call with the leaders of France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Italy, and they've all put out a joint statement, a pretty strong joint statement, actually, expressing support for Israel, condemnation of Hamas. So he has sort of a coalition-like approach to this. But everyone's looking to the United States for leadership. Everyone's looking to the United States, looking for clues as to what Biden's going to do next. It's going to be really important. Tolu's analysis reminds us that in moments like this, presidents have multiple audiences. They have the international audience, they have the domestic audience. Even in the international audience, they're not all the same. What the Israelis are going to hear is one thing, what the Iranians are going to hear is a different thing. And that's why we really want to tune in to see what Biden tells the world.
A lot of anticipation for this, Rhonda. What do you have to share with us about what you're watching and what President Biden has said thus far and what he could say today?
Well, immediately we heard him say that there is unwavering support for Israel. And as Olivia just said, there have been calls between Netanyahu and Biden. There was also one that the White House said was planned for today, along with Vice President Harris. I know we're waiting for a readout on that. But I would expect that today he is going to use this opportunity to appeal to the American people as well and tell them why overall the United States needs to take the lead when it comes to international conflict. This is a nation that through polling we've seen waning support for helping Ukraine. That's somewhat of a political question right now too in Congress. So this might be an opportunity for him to kind of lay out why the U.S. needs to take the lead. I'll also be listening out for what he might have to say to the public about the missing Americans. I don't know if you all caught that press conference this morning with the family members who say—
Tell us more about it. Yeah.
Well, it was very emotional. They represented families who have missing Americans who were taken throughout the weekend. They have not heard any news yet, they said, from either Israel or the U.S. government. So they want answers, and they want the strength of the United States to get those answers. So I'm expecting or hopeful that the president might touch on that right now. And also just tell the American people what the latest is.
Olivier, the press conference that Rhonda's referring to took place in Israel. People talking about American citizens. At the end, a reporter said, well, are you hearing, asked the question, are you hearing anything from the Israeli leadership? And one man finally said bluntly, no. Like, I'm going to be blunt and say no. How important is that communication and outreach in a moment like this?
I think it's extremely important, but you have to understand, too, that the fighting was still going on as of this morning. And so the authorities are trying to get information about who's been abducted, who's been killed. The data we got from the administration last night was that at least 11 Americans were killed by Hamas. And it is likely that some number of Americans have been taken hostage. It doesn't sound like we have a precise figure on that yet, but we might get one from the president today. And of course, this calls back the Afghan withdrawal when a number of American citizens, a lot of them dual citizens, were left behind in Afghanistan. So it's a particularly sensitive point for this administration.
Tolu, what will you be listening for today as we hear President Biden address the nation in this moment of crisis in Israel and also for the people, frankly, of Gaza?
A number of different things. I'll be listening to see whether President Biden talks about the specific aid that the U.S. is prepared to deliver to Israel, what kind of additional military assets and military support that the U.S. is ready to provide. Also, I'll be looking for the subtext of what he says that may be interpreted as a call for restraint, may be interpreted as a call for Prime Minister Netanyahu and people in his far-right government to not have an all-out besiege approach towards the Gaza Strip, knowing that there are a number of innocent civilians that are living there. I'll also be looking to see if he remarks on the U.S. domestic situation, which includes a lack of a Speaker of the House, chaos in the House of Representatives, and Congress being at a standstill, which would make it very difficult for the U.S. to provide any new legislative support for Israel. And so those are a number of things that I'll be watching to see whether the president touches on those things as well as sort of how he orients his remarks to make sure that he's, as Olivier said, speaking both to the domestic audience but also to the multiple international audiences that are going to be tuning in.
Rhonda, since Tolu mentioned it, let's talk a little bit more about Congress right now. How does this situation affect Republicans picking a speaker? Does it, you talked about how this could sort of clarify the mind a bit and show the importance of having leadership in Congress, but does this change the calculations they make as they do pick a speaker?
I think this is definitely there looming overhead. A lot of members are saying that this is frustrating right now for them to be in this situation where it does not appear that they may have a speaker by the end of today or tomorrow. They just don't know. They don't know which speaker candidate has enough votes at this point. But a lot of people are saying, like, this is the reason why you can't play games. This is the reason why you can't have a motion to vacate, which allows one member to start a vote that would oust a speaker. So I think that this is all a part of the calculations that they're discussing, but we'll have to see how much. Does it change the tone enough where they will put these differences aside and try to put someone in the speakership seat this week? We saw Kevin McCarthy, the former House Speaker. He came to the microphones yesterday talking about the conflict and saying all the things that he has credentials for and sort of alluding that he would take the job if they voted for him again. So I think people are going to take opportunities here and use this situation to kind of promote whatever way they stand on the speakership vote. But it does sort of add some urgency to the House conference to see if they can figure out who can be speaker soon.
Olivier, what is the danger in Congress having its eye off the ball at this moment?
Well, in the short term, there's not a lot, frankly. The administration is saying that it does not at this moment need Congress to weigh in. They don't need Congress to approve anything in particular. Now, if the conflict drags on, that's going to change. That could change pretty quickly. But right now, the immediate needs of Israel appear to be met. Those are replenishment of the Iron Dome anti-missile defense system, shipment of ammunition and the like. There are ammunition stockpiles in Israel that normally the United States would use in a regional conflict, but they've been known to give Israel access to that in the past. So in the short term, there's not a ton of danger. In the longer term, obviously, Congress not having its act together, if the Biden administration has come forward and requested aid for Israel, then we get into a different picture.
Tolu, we've touched on the relationship between President Biden and Netanyahu, but tell us more about that dynamic. We know that Biden calls himself a staunch supporter of Israel. He has a very different relationship with Netanyahu than Donald Trump did when he was president. So what do we know about how Biden is viewing that relationship and how he needs to treat and deal with Netanyahu in this moment?
It has been a complicated relationship. It's a relationship that spans several decades. Biden has often talked about how he met Netanyahu when he was a young senator back in the 1970s. And so they do have a lot of history together. They do have a better relationship than Netanyahu had with former President Obama, but a much worse relationship than Netanyahu had with former President Donald Trump. And so it has been complicated over the past year as Prime Minister Netanyahu's government has pursued a number of these controversial judicial restructuring efforts, and we've seen Biden speak out publicly against some of those efforts, which is very rare for a president to speak out critically of what's happening from the Prime Minister's office in Israel. And so that relationship has been complicated, but in the aftermath of these terrorist attacks, we have seen President Biden speak very positively about Israel, very positively about Prime Minister Netanyahu, and very much in support of what Netanyahu has done and how he's responded. And we have seen the closeness of that relationship increase. And so I do expect that when we hear from President Biden later today, it will be mostly full of support for Israel, the people of Israel, the government of Israel, the effort of Prime Minister Netanyahu to respond to these attacks and to secure his country. And so I think some of those disagreements may fall by the wayside, at least publicly, because in this moment of crisis, in this moment of war, it's not unexpected that the U.S. government would be firmly in support of what Israel is doing. And so in these early stages, I would expect to hear from President Biden nothing but steadfast support for Israel, and that includes steadfast support for Prime Minister Netanyahu as well.
Olivier, Israel has had its own political turmoil in recent years, a lot of pushback against Netanyahu, investigations into him. There is this irony of solidification and unity because of this external attack. Can you talk to us about what you're watching in terms of Israel and its response right now?
Well, right now, Israel is struggling to form a unity government. That would be the most logical response to an attack like this, bringing in folks from outside the governing coalition to kind of give to forge a more national consensus on the way forward. So that's something to watch pretty carefully. That picture is moving very, very fast. One minute they think they have a deal, the next minute they don't. That's sort of the way it is with fractious Israeli politics, but that's definitely something to watch over there. Because actually the unity in their government is infinitely more important than whether we have a speaker when it comes to the response to the attack by Hamas.
Can you talk to us about the involvement of Iran? You know, you've touched on this already, but there's so much focus now on the relationship between Hamas and Iran. What do we know and what questions are there?
We know that for decades Iran has supported Hamas with equipment, with money, and with training. If you look at the comments from senior administration officials over the last 72 hours or so, there's a refrain that emerges. Iran is complicit by virtue of their decades-long relationship with Hamas, but whether they had a specific role in this attack is not yet as clear. That, by the way, is also what you hear from the Israeli Defense Forces, that they of course are very, very keenly aware of the years-long relationship of Iran's patronage of Hamas, but they can't speak yet to the precise relationship here. The fact that Hezbollah in Lebanon doesn't seem to have much of a coordinated response could be an indication that Iran was not steeped in this current plot, because of course they have a patronage relationship with Hezbollah as well. We saw some statements, this is to be taken with a gigantic grain of salt, but we've seen some statements from Hamas officials who say that they did not give Iran a heads up until after the operation had begun. Now, whether that's because of operational security or because Iran just wasn't as closely tied into this, I can't say right now. But one of the messages from the Biden administration has been, for the last couple of days, has been to tell Iran and to tell Syria and other players in the region, don't get involved. Stay out of this.
How does Biden weigh that against the backdrop of his dealings with Iran and the administration's dealings with Iran in the last weeks and months?
Well, that relationship is also in turmoil with the investigation into one of the people who led his Iran policy, Robert Malley, who's been under some investigations. Biden initially tried to return to the Iran nuclear deal of the Obama era. That has not worked. He has tried to counter Iran malign influence in the region with somewhat more success. But yeah, I think it's fairly safe to say that the Iran nuclear diplomacy now, at least for the foreseeable future, is going to be in tatters because of this attack. It's enormously difficult now for President Biden to spend any kind of political capital heading into a presidential election year on a deal with a country that has, again, this patronage relationship with Hamas.
And then, Rhonda, of course, there's a relationship the members of Congress have with Iran and Israel. So many members of Congress are coming out with strong support of Israel. What weight do their words have in this moment as they look for fault and blame and as they also look to show support?
Yeah, I think as soon as the news of the attack happened, you saw members of Congress across the aisle all said that they stand in support of Israel. And of course, that's historically what we usually see from Congress, that there is a lot of strong bipartisan support for supporting Israel. I think one of the notable things that everybody wanted to find out more about is how the progressive wing of the Democratic Party in the House feels about this attack and this question of continuous support for Israel. One person in particular, Rashida Tlaib, she is a Palestinian American representative from Michigan. She called out the attack, but she also said that the nation needs to examine how much it gives to Israel. And that's something that is not supported by the Democratic Party as a whole, but you do see this wing of Democrats who, when the question does come down to any further aid that might come in front of Congress in the long term, you might see progressives try to push back on that or be more vocal about that. But I think overall what we have seen from members of Congress is continuous bipartisan public support for Israel.
Tolu, it's this complicated reality of American politics that the campaign for 2024 and the presidential race is really already happening. But this is something that can't happen in isolation. President Biden's speech today, his response to the attack on Israeli citizens, doesn't just happen in a bubble. So how does he have to think about his long-term political interests as well as the United States' long-term interests?
He is definitely well aware of the calendar and the fact that there is an active Republican primary taking place. There are just a matter of months before voters are going to be voting not only in the Republican primary, but also considering their choice for the Democratic race. And so President Biden is aware that everything that he says is going to be looked at through the lens of 2024. He's already faced a number of critiques from his Republican rivals over his interactions with Iran and his policies towards Iran. And a number of Republican candidates have accused him without evidence of funding this terrorist attack. And so he is in a very pitched political environment in which every word that he says and even his physical appearance will be watched, and people will be parsing his appearance for the political benefits or the political liabilities that may come from it. And so the president, who's going to be turning 81 in a few weeks, is going to need to not only project a sense of strength and a sense of wisdom about foreign affairs, but he'll need to show Americans that he's on the case and that this is not going to become a broader, long-running conflagration that leads to a bigger kind of war that could involve U.S. troops, involve U.S. assets, and involve more and more U.S. taxpayer dollars. And so I do think it's going to be important for him to address the domestic audience, the political audience, the people that are going to be making a choice in the next year about who should be leading the country through the kinds of trials that face a president, like wars, and he'll need to speak to them as well as speak to, the world and the global audience about the leadership of the U.S. at this time of political division in our country, where it does seem like we're divided over so many different things. He needs to be able to show that he can unite the country, that he can lead the country through this trying moment, and also lead the world and be a leader on the world stage as well.
You're listening to Tolu Olorunnipa, our White House bureau chief. We are awaiting remarks from President Biden in the wake of this attack on Israeli citizens by Hamas and the aftermath, everything that's happened since then, including attacks from Israel into Gaza. We do have this reportable from the White House that the president and Vice President Harris have concluded a call with Prime Minister Netanyahu to discuss what they frame as their support for Israel. We'll be hearing more about that, Olivier and Rhonda, when we do hear from President Biden. Olivier, how much does President Biden need to think about motivating Americans to focus on this? I mean, if you were on social media, there really was a large focus, it seemed, in many generations of Americans this weekend into what had happened. So how much does he need to crystallize the stakes here in the minds of Americans?
I don't know that he needs to do that very much at this point in the conflict. It is still extremely fresh. Social media is awash with horrifying images coming out of Israel. At this moment, the American public is focused pretty keenly on what happened since Friday. He does, though, I think, need to banish some of the questions, some of the doubts. How many Americans have been killed? Do we know how many Americans have been taken hostage? What will his administration do about the hostages? These are important questions that a lot of Americans have, and these are important questions that we have not really had precise answers from the administration about. They're talking about supporting the Israelis in planning and in logistics and things like that to help to get the hostages. But that's a little bit on the vague side, and it is an enormous question. This is one of the most horrifying dimensions of this attack was the mass taking of hostages. Between 130 and 150 people dragged back into Gaza by Hamas fighters. And the group says it will execute one every time Israel carries out an airstrike without prior warning. So that's one of the most horrifying dimensions of this whole thing, and I think the president needs to address that part of the picture.
Rhonda, let's talk about who watches this speech. We've been thinking about this in terms of the international audience, the domestic audience, the political audience. How does Biden balance those needs?
I think it is one talking about what America will be doing moving forward. I think the transparency that he gave when he gave speeches on Ukraine at the beginning days of that war, that might be important for all audiences right now, specifically the American audience who, as I've mentioned before, this is a America that is sort of waning support for getting involved in foreign affairs. He's going to have to make the case of why and what's at stake, why we are supposed to be involved in something like this. I think he is running for president, of course, and there are political implications too to doing this correctly. He, of course, has a long history in foreign affairs, having led that committee, Foreign Relations, in the Senate for a while. That does separate him perhaps from some of the Republican contenders in their GOP primary. So he also has to show that he's in command of the situation, too, when you think of the politics. But right now, this is so early, and all the information we're getting from it and the photos are so devastating that I think Americans just need some comfort right now in understanding how America is going to be involved and how we're addressing this.
Olivier, Rhonda brought up Ukraine. It is not far from the minds of people at the highest levels of our national security, as well as our State Department, about that war creating sort of a terrible backdrop to this, very different parts of the world. But Russia could play an influencing role in many places on the world stage, not just Ukraine. So talk to us about how you're watching other world players, from Russia to China.
So until this attack, I would have said that Russia and Israel actually had a pretty decent relationship. But Vladimir Putin's comments today coming out and not really condemning the attack and instead saying this was a failure of American policy, that's going to pour a lot of cold water on that relationship. China's really a very interesting player here. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer of New York is in China right now. He met with Xi Jinping, the country's leader. And in addition to apparently successfully asking him to toughen China's public statements on the attack, he also asked Xi Jinping to use China's influence with Iran to keep Iran from widening the conflict. So China's potential role is very interesting here, not just its influence on Iran, but also a Chinese-born Israeli woman was among the hostages. So they have a stake in the retrieval of the hostages as well. And you'll remember that earlier this year, China facilitated, brokered, whatever word you would like to use, the resumption of formal diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, historically two antagonists fighting for influence over the region. So China's a very important player here. I mentioned Saudi Arabia. That's another player to watch very closely.
Please talk to us more about that.
So they have, until the Iran nuclear deal, the Saudis have played an important role in floating Middle East peace proposals and standing up for the Palestinians. There was a recalibration in the Obama era, with the Saudis worrying a lot more about Iran than about the fate of the Palestinians. It actually brought the Saudis and the Israelis closer together. That's what the Biden administration was trying to capitalize on recently, but trying to push a normalization agreement between those two countries. So Saudi Arabia is going to be important. United Arab Emirates, also important. They apparently just reached out to Iran to say, don't get involved. Again, this is one of the most important messages you're going to get out of American diplomacy to Iran, not to get involved, not to widen this into a regional conflict. So those are just some of the players. I want to see what happens in the European Union now. There are questions about European aid to the Palestinians. Will it continue? In what form? You saw an outpouring of solidarity. The Eiffel Tower lit up in the Israeli flag colors, the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin being lighted up in the Israeli flag colors. So I want to see what the European Union decides, how they decide to respond. They're not going to be a military player here, but they certainly could flex their aid money. So I think that's probably a quick and dirty rundown of some of the important players here.
And Tolu, let's talk about other relationships that President Biden has with world leaders and who he may be calling into sort of the fold right now as he thinks about how America responds to this.
Yes, he's been on the phone with multiple leaders, specifically in Europe, a number of the leaders that he's gotten pretty close to because they've had a number of different calls and discussions and meetings over the war in Ukraine. And so they've had a lot of practice discussing the modalities of war, the modalities of trying to calibrate themselves in a way where they support one side, but also don't tip the world into a broader World War III kind of scenario. And so he's been on the phone with the leader of France and the leader of the UK and the leader of other European European nations, in part because he has wanted to show himself and show America as a world leader committed to this ideal of, the post-industrial, post-World War II setup in which the U.S. continues to lead the free world and lead the world to follow, a lot of the guidelines that have been in place on the international stage for such a long time. A lot of guidelines that President Biden and a number of his allies say that his predecessor and his potential competitor in the 2024 race, Donald Trump, walked away from. And so he wants to show that the U.S. continues to support these ideals, continues to support democracy, continues to be a leader on the world stage. And so I would expect him to continue to have those conversations with a number of U.S. allies. And I think it's also important that he'll be having conversations with countries that are not, as steadfast in their alliances with the U.S., but also will be important here. Countries like Saudi Arabia, countries in the Middle East, countries that are going to play a role here because it's important for the U.S. to be in conversation with a number of different countries that could play a role in trying to keep this contained and trying to keep this from spiraling into a bigger war or a bigger effort that involves a number of different parties. And so I would expect those calls to continue, not only at the presidential level, but also between diplomats and between senior advisors. And this will be something that lasts for a long time. This will be something that will have to be a big part of President Biden's presidency, devoting his energy, devoting the energy of his staff to trying to make sure that this is handled in an appropriate way.
If you're just tuning in, we are watching for President Biden to speak any moment now. Tolu Olorunipa is our White House bureau chief. I'm also joined by Olivier Knox, who among his duties writes the Daily 202. Rhonda Colvin, senior political correspondent. Olivier, let's just take a step back and reset. You pointed out at the beginning of our broadcast this afternoon how shocking the attack was and how really unprepared the Israeli forces appeared to be. And the Israeli forces are known for having intelligence, having a strong force. Can you just give us some perspective again, fresh perspective on what this has meant to the people of Israel and also what the potential is for this just to be such a terrible igniting spark for the region?
Sure. So the Israelis have world-class intelligence services, both domestic and foreign. Mossad and Shin Bet are both very highly thought of in the intelligence community in the United States and in France and in other countries that make it their business to be very good at that stuff. Their special forces are very highly regarded. But their overall military is made up of a lot of conscripts. They just called up 360,000 reservists. That's an astonishing number if you think about the population of Israel being a hair over 9 million people. The national trauma here is hard to overstate. The thinking for such a long time was that Israel had disengaged from the Gaza Strip and had bottled it up and had erected, a barrier, intelligence gathering, et cetera, that would ensure, the thinking went, that they would not break out and carry out anything like this. Again, the sophistication of this was they came by land, they came by sea, they came by air. They used drones, which had not been a main feature of their past attacks on Israel. So the sophistication, the scale of it, and unfortunately, as we discover hour by hour, day by day, the extent of the carnage in a lot of these Israeli settlements. This is what's driving the language that you hear from the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, or the Defense Minister, Minister Gallant, that Gaza will never return to what it was, that Hamas has to be destroyed. And again, that points in the general direction of a ground offensive by Israeli forces in Gaza, which would be a dramatic escalation in the situation. It may be what Israel needs to do, but it raises a ton of questions about the future of the region. It raises a lot of questions, honestly, about whether the Israeli defense forces are up for the kind of house-to-house fighting that we might see there.
But also what it means for the people of Gaza, who have been penned in and who aren't necessarily Hamas.
Who are dependent on Israel for electrical power. They're dependent on Israel for drinkable water. They're dependent on Israel for food.
And Israel is now cutting a lot of those resources off.
That's right. They don't control their own airspace. They don't control their own electromagnetic spectrum. This is what life under the occupation looks like. And it's true. We haven't had an election in the Gaza Strip in, I believe, 17 years. So there's no popular legitimacy to Hamas. What legitimacy they claim to is basically derived from two things: attacking Israel and providing services to the people of Gaza.
Rhonda, this is happening in the backdrop of the United States trying to figure out its speakership in the House of Representatives. Members of Congress were even over there in Israel. A couple members were over there when the attack took place. What are you hearing from Congress today?
Yeah, and to that point, Cory Booker did put out a video. He and his team left early because of what happened over the weekend.
He was in Jerusalem.
Right, in Jerusalem for a speech. Yes, this is happening in the backdrop of what's also happening in the interpolitics of Capitol Hill. I was just looking at my email and see that members of Congress will be briefed tomorrow at 8:30 a.m., all members on Israel by officials from the State Department. That timing is interesting. That happens at 8:30 a.m. and at 9 a.m. the Republican caucus is planning to do a secret ballot vote in a closed-door meeting where they will choose what name they will put on the floor for a speakership vote. So it seems like a confluence of many different things going on Capitol Hill, and also just highlights that without a speaker, yes, Congress can move on in certain ways. As I mentioned, Michael McCall, who heads the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House, has been asking for this resolution be passed by unanimous consent. Some things can happen without a speaker. But overall, this is underscoring that we have a bicameral system. One house can't work without the other. And this also is a sign to the American public that you need some sturdiness in your legislative branch.
Tolu, we are watching here outside the Oval Office and preparing for President Biden to speak. It could be really any moment. Can you talk to us about President Biden's general foreign policy philosophy? What is he trying to do? What does he see as the role of the United States in a moment like this?
Well, it's hard to talk about his general philosophy without talking about his predecessor, Donald Trump. I think had it not been for President Trump, President Biden may have had a different approach to foreign policy, but he came into office determined to show that America was quote unquote back, that he would reverse what he believed was the slide and the shrinking away of America's foreign policy leadership role under Trump's America First policy, which was seen as more isolationist. And so President Biden has leaned into this idea of having America lead on the world stage, but also having America lead coalitions. He's always wanted to have countries joining together, forming coalitions, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific or whether it's in the Middle East or in Europe, having a coalition of countries, having the support of the global leaders on the global stage to show that it's not America alone, but it's about alliances, it's about partnerships, and it's about countries banding together. And so as it relates to this current situation, I do think that he will lean into this broader idea that the U.S.-Israel relationship is strong, it's historic, it's based on shared values and shared partnerships that have gone on for decades and for quite a long time across different parties, across different presidencies. And I do think he'll want to show that he's been on the phone and discussing this with other world leaders as well, talking to his partners in Europe to show that this is something that the United States is doing not on its own, not without specifically speaking about these things with its partners, but leading a global partnership, leading a global alliances to decide what to do, decide how to address these challenges that Israel is facing. And so I do think he'll be talking about that, and it fits very well into the kind of foreign policy that he's led, that is driven in part by trying to show the world that America under Biden will be much different than it was under his predecessor, and also, as we talked about, the fact that he has a both domestic audience and an international audience. He'll want to show domestic viewers, Americans, that he is not only leading the world, but also up to the task of leading a world that is facing wars not only in Europe, but also in the Middle East at the same time.
Olivier, Tolu was talking earlier about the various allies that President Biden has been speaking with and reaching out to. Yesterday, we saw a joint statement on Israel come out. Can you talk to us about the significance of that and what sort of unified message world leaders are trying to send?
Historically, the Europeans have been more mindful of the plight of the Palestinians than the United States. I'm simplifying a complicated relationship here. what was striking about that statement was how they were all on the same page and how they were all condemning the attack. I don't remember seeing a reference to the so-called two-state solution, which has been, on the table for Middle East peace for a very long time without much progress. And so it was significant to see that kind of unity. Now, that unity is going to be tested in the coming days, possibly weeks, by the Israeli operations, by the airstrikes in Gaza that we've seen over the last 24 hours or so, and by the potential for a ground operation. To say nothing of Israeli official pronouncements that suggest collective punishment, punishing everybody in Gaza for the actions of Hamas. So it's going to get tested. I don't know how quickly, but there's a chance that you're going to start seeing some daylight between some of the European leaders and Biden. I say not soon because, again, the images that are coming out, the information that's coming out about what Hamas fighters did in Israel, that information is still fresh. It's still coming out. It has not lost any capacity to shock. And so that has sort of welded that kind of unity, transatlantic unity that we've seen.
And there's also the reality of hostages. And so as long as that is a situation, a reality on the ground, that may also be a unifying.
There will be different pushes in different countries about either punishing Hamas or accommodating Hamas and the rest of it. This is another parallel to 9/11 in that a lot of people from other countries were killed in those attacks. And so what you see now is among the 130 to 150 hostages, you see people from all kinds of different countries, America, of course, but also British, French, German, Chinese. And so that has some effect on how these countries respond.
Olivier, presidents give speeches at moments in their tenure from the White House. This is one that it sounds like you are interested in seeing and hearing, the content and also the delivery that President Biden gives today.
Absolutely.
Why and what are you listening for?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm of course listening to this as a journalist, and so I've got some outstanding questions, notably how many Americans were killed in the attacks, if we know. How many Americans were taken hostages, if we know. What is the United States' role going to be in the Israeli response? We've got some information there already, but it would be nice to hear from the president himself. And then there's one big question, which is, what does an Israeli success look like? This has bedeviled Biden's efforts on Ukraine for a year and a half. The question of what is the end game here? What does victory look like? What does success look like? And they've punted it to Ukraine and said the terms of success are up to the Ukrainians. It will be up to them to decide when they've reached the strategic goals. I want to hear whether he says something similar about this situation.
If he were to do that, though, does that give Israel carte blanche to do what it chooses? And is there a real danger in that?
Tolu was very capably laying out the balancing act that President Biden faces in these remarks. I'll point out as well, it's 8:37 p.m. over there.
In Jerusalem,
important to think about the international audience there too. He's giving an afternoon speech in D.C., a primetime speech in the region. That's also very, very important. So I'm also looking to hear what does he say to the other players or potential players in this conflict. Is there a straightforward warning to Iran? Is there a similar warning to Syria? How does he characterize the role of the American aircraft carrier strike group in the Eastern Mediterranean? What does he talk about in terms of the potential for further attacks? Frankly, there are questions now about whether we need to worry in the United States about possible threats. And so far, the FBI says it has not detected any specific or credible threats. But I want to, if he mentions that would certainly be extremely notable. But so he's got a lot of different messages that I'm listening to as a journalist.
Rhonda, what can the president do or not do with or without Congress?
Yeah, that is a question that the executive branch has certainly been looking at over the weekend and commenting on. We heard from Antony Blinken, who did say that they can move forward without any sort of approval from Congress on certain things, specifically that there is an Obama-era agreement where the United States gives $3.8 billion to Israel annually. So they can rely on that. Further down the line, there might be aid packages that, of course, Congress is going to have to weigh in on. And I'm not saying we're there yet, but if there were any sort of American presence in the region, Congress would have to be a part of that. But for right now, the administration and the State Department is saying we do have our existing obligations that we've already agreed upon since the Obama administration in giving billions of dollars of aid to Israel. The Iron Dome, we've talked about that. That is something that I'm hearing on the Hill from Republicans and Democrats who want to look into replenishing that system. The United States, since 2011, has been a part of replenishing the batteries, the missiles, to give air defense to Israel. So America, well before this weekend, has been critically involved in that defense system, and all signs on the Hill appear that they would want to, as soon as they're up and running, want to continue that effort. But for now, the administration is discussing the reality of having to go this alone right now until the Congress is up and running.
Olivier, talk to us about Iron Dome and its sustainability right now, and also just some basics about how capable it is and what it does.
It's a remarkably capable system using a missile to take out a rocket. It's a U.S.-developed system, and it was provided to Israel many years ago under the Obama administration. It has been one of the most effective defensive armaments that Israel has. Traditionally, both Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza have used rockets as their principal tool for attacking Israel.
Because they can do it from their own territories and lands.
They can do it from their own territory. That's right. It's relatively low risk for them. And so this is an extremely important component of Israeli national defense. They've obviously been called upon to use it an awful lot since Friday, since part of the attack from Hamas has been a deluge of rockets aimed at Israeli cities and towns, and actually quite considerably more precise than in the past and longer range than in the past. And so they've been using Iron Dome a lot in the last 72 hours. I've seen reports that they haven't depleted completely their Iron Dome ammunition, but they certainly wouldn't hate to get more from the United States. And so I think that's going to be one of the roles that the Biden administration shoulders is making sure that they keep current. At this point, I should also say the weapons that are being used in Israel are not the same ones that are being used in Ukraine. So it's not like you're robbing Peter to pay Paul here. They're different. No one would expect, say, a shipment of javelins to go to Israel because they're not facing a tank. They're not facing a tank threat. But Iron Dome, absolutely.
I'm glad that you brought up that sort of non-equal reality, and I want to talk more about that in a moment. But first, Tolu, you are anticipating this speech as well with great interest. What stands out to you in terms of the questions that President Biden may need to answer, and also how he will talk about this with both tone as well as support for Israelis and threats to others?
I think you can't minimize the optics of this moment. President Biden, at the age that he is, he's going to be 81 soon, needs to project strength. There's no other way to say that. That's going to be a constant theme of his re-election pitch, and we've seen his campaign try to do that in ads, focusing on how he traveled to Ukraine and took the dangerous step of going there earlier this year. And so this is one of those moments that the American people look to their president to show strength, to show a sense of purpose, to show a sense of strategy. And so I do think he needs to come out and be confident. He needs to come out and answer a number of the questions that his domestic audience will have about what this all means. The fact that we may have American hostages being held by terrorists in a foreign country. What does that mean? What does the American government plan to do about that? I think he will need to answer some of those questions, while also leaning into the fact that he has always been known for several years as a consoler in chief. This is a moment of crisis. This is a moment of tragedy. We've had hundreds of people killed, and the prospect of hundreds or even thousands of more casualties as this war escalates. And he does need to project a sense of consolation for the people who are watching, and also a sense that he is at the till. He's essentially taking control of this situation and playing a leadership role. He needs to show that he is in control, that he is up to the task, that he's mentally and physically capable of handling this crisis with all of the other crises that are going on in the world and in the U.S. economy. And so I do think this is a major speech for him. This is going to be a major moment in which he's going to need to project that strength, not only for that domestic audience that we've talked about, but also for the foreign audiences. That includes both foreign allies as well as potential enemies and those who might be hostile to what the U.S. is doing. He needs to be able to look them in the eye as well and show a sense of resolve, and also lay out the stakes of this moment to make sure that this doesn't escalate any further.
Rhonda, funding for Ukraine's defense in the wake of Russia's invasion has been a question mark on Capitol Hill, and there's been this Republican resistance in some quarters. Now, there are some very hawkish Republicans who are very on the side of giving Ukraine funds and weapons, but there's a growing, grumbling body of Republicans, especially in the House, who are bucking that and against it. How could the White House, or how could leaders in Congress potentially tie these two questions together of funding for Ukraine with funding for Israel?
I think that's something that, and Tolu also kind of touched on this, that Biden is going to have to address why we are supposed to be the nation involved in helping keep regions safe, keeping the globe safe. It's been interesting with Congress, where at the start of the Ukraine war with Russia, there was bipartisanship like you've never seen. Now we're seeing it as really a defining question where Republicans are using it to run off of. We've seen the 2024 candidates say that when they're president, they don't want to continue Ukraine funding. We've heard House GOP members say that. So it's a real question right now on the Hill with the future of Ukraine funding. We're also seeing it tied up in the appropriations bills as well. I think if Biden can come out and talk about just broadly what's at stake when the U.S. is absent, that might help the American public understand where his administration is coming from on both the Ukraine front and the Israel question. I think one of the things that might make some Americans uneasy right now is the fact that Israel has formally declared this a war, which suggests that this could be prolonged. And that's something, especially in an election year when people will be deciding who their next leader is, that's going to be something that they might need some convincing on why we would be involved. Now, with Israel, because we have had such a historic relationship and bipartisan relationship, it's not exactly the same question as Ukraine, but it still is this overall issue right now in our politics, is how far do we go on the foreign fronts.
And Olivier, I mean, some of the Republican contenders for president bring up Israel in their stump speeches and their support of Israel in their stump speeches. I'm thinking Nikki Haley, someone who's more of like a traditional Republican and less of this MAGA Republican, despite her work for the Trump administration. So how do you see these two things either being linked or separated?
It's a good question. I mean, we're going to see a lot more campaign trail rhetoric about this as it goes on, because as we've all said, it's unlikely that this is going to get wrapped up very, very quickly. It affords the Republican candidates an avenue for attacking Biden, so of course that appeals to them. The message is that, you know, under Biden there is chaos and violence and war. The politics of Ukraine, the politics of Israel, I'm seeing Republicans quietly say that they don't support pairing them. House Republicans say they don't support pairing that. That was
through a funding package.
Some of our colleagues reported on in the last couple of days, that the administration was thinking, well, what if we bundled, you know, the Ukraine package with Israeli aid to Israel to make it more palatable to more people. I'm seeing some Republican voices saying, no, if you do that, we will decouple them and vote on them separately. But here the X factor, I think, is the Senate, which may very well just say, fine, we'll pair them and we'll act. But I'm not sure what the path is. And also, again, I guess we might hear from the president on this, what Israel needs that the Congress would need to act on. Because again, so far, the administration has said we're not at a place where we need Congress to appropriate any new funds, any new aid for Israel.
Let's talk about Israel's options right now, and also what option the Palestinian people have. And are they really just at the mercy of what Hamas decides and does, and then how Israel reacts? So let's start with the back end of that. Tell us about the Palestinian people, Olivier, and what they may be facing.
So we need to separate the Palestinian people into at least two groups. Okay, the folks who live in Gaza under Hamas's rule, and the folks who live in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority. The folks who live in Gaza are pretty well bottled up. There are two ways, basically, in and out, two significant ways in and out of of Gaza, one crossing controlled by Israel, another controlled by Egypt. They have been told by Israel to evacuate areas where Israel is planning an imminent military operation. And so we think via the United Nations that there are not quite 200,000 Palestinians who have been displaced from their homes. That's going to be enormously significant. The folks in Gaza, I mean, barring other than sort of temporary evacuations from areas that Israel is going to hit, they don't have a ton of options, frankly. I'm embarrassed to say I have not really looked carefully at what the Palestinian Authority is doing in the West Bank and how they've responded to this. They expelled Hamas some years ago. There were tensions between those two groups, but I confess I'm not fresh up on what they've been saying. But they don't have a ton of options either here. One of the things to watch for is communications between the Palestinian Authority and other regional leaders. I believe there was a call between the Saudi Crown Prince and Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the PA. We should watch for more of those, just to see how they are responding on a diplomatic level. But I don't know that anyone's going to be taking a phone call from Hamas anytime soon.
Let's talk about the Israeli people and what they're facing right now. Olivier, as we talked about, this has been a horrific surprise attack. Many people are touched throughout the country, frankly, throughout the world, by what's happened. Talk to us about what Israelis are facing right now.
National trauma on the scale of what the United States felt after 9/11. The shock at the sophistication, at not seeing this coming, of having this vaunted national security establishment that appears to have been caught flat-footed. The scale and scope of the violence with entire families being massacred. Hamas did not just go after Israeli defense forces, the Israeli military. They went after families all over the country, and they did it with extraordinary savagery. We know, this is a little bit anecdotal, but we know, for example, of a family that found out that their beloved grandmother had been murdered because a Hamas fighter took a video of the body on the grandmother's phone and then uploaded it to her Facebook page, which is how her family found out. So they're in a state of deep national trauma. If you look at the rhetoric from Israeli officials, it's very important to watch this. They're talking about wiping out Hamas, not just retaliating, not punishing Hamas, but actually eradicating them. And the scale and scope of that operation is going to be just enormous, including, as I've said before, there's a likelihood of a ground operation in the Gaza Strip by the Israelis.
Let's talk about what that would look like and what the components of that might be.
Right. So it's very, very complicated, in part because of the presence of those 130, 150 hostages, right? Hamas is very dug in Gaza. They've got a tunnel network. They obviously know the terrain better than the IDF do. We know that urban fighting, you'll remember some of the big fights during the Iraq War, right? Fallujah, places like that. We know that urban fighting is uniquely dangerous and difficult. It's a little harder to bring your air power to bear in a way that's helpful to the folks on the ground. Right now, Israel's unchallenged in the air, right? They can carry out any airstrikes they want over Gaza. That changes a little bit. It's a little harder to bring close air support to bear when you've got people on the ground fighting house to house. But again, if the Israelis really are going to do what they are promising to do, which is eradicate Hamas, again, not merely punish them, not merely rescue the hostages, but actually purge Hamas entirely, which is what the defense minister has said and the prime minister has said, then I don't know that they have a lot of other pathways to get there without a ground operation.
Well, joining us now live from Jerusalem is Miriam Berger, reporter covering the Middle East and foreign affairs. Miriam, it is in the evening there. What has it been like being in Israel at a moment like this?
Well, it's people here are quite shocked amongst Jewish Israelis. Even still, many shops are closed. Even here in Jerusalem, which is relatively far away from where the violence was happening down south. But there's just sort of a mass mobilization of people as well. Soldiers are coming back from abroad, so it's really extremely tense, and there's a lot of fears about what's going to come.
Israel's working to launch an all-out assault on Gaza, potentially a siege on Gaza. What is it like on the ground?
It's right now, Gazans are quite terrified about what could be coming, and they have no way out effectively. There's these talk that there's going to be, an incoming invasion. And there's really, Gaza City and the rest of Gaza is right now just, being heavily bombed. Israel says it's targeting Hamas targets. There's 2.3 million people in an area that's like twice the size of Washington, D.C. It's extremely small. So many civilians are being killed, and, civilian infrastructure is being hit. And it's just, people, there's very little internet connection, cellular connection, dwindling water, electricity. It's a very, very scary time for people.
Well, we've seen photos and videos online showing the scale and the brutality of the attack by Hamas militants. Has Israel witnessed anything like this before, Miriam?
It has not. This is a really unprecedented moment and time for the country. Both in terms of the level of just the casualties and the death count, also in terms of the sort of larger, failures in terms of security. This is really, people sort of say this is a paradigm shift, and also in terms of its approach to Gaza, of sort of trying to contain the situation there. Which clearly hasn't worked for Palestinians, and right now also the sort of feeling that there's going to be a very bloody invasion there, and a lot of just fear about what comes next, because as I said, the sort of tit for tats that have come to become very sort of unfortunately normalized here, it's no longer happening.
Miriam Berger joining us live from Jerusalem, where it's almost 9 o'clock at night. Thank you so much for talking with us. Olivia,
thank you for having me.
Thank you. I just want to get a reaction from you about what Miriam's talking about. And one of the things that that you see, we're also print people. You're a print guy. You work in various media. Not at all. but you do see the power of images and videos, and that's why we do what we do here. The images, as Miriam talked about, have been so arresting and so horrifying. What about communications from the people in Gaza, getting word out from Gaza about what they may be experiencing if they're civilians with families and Israelis are raining fire down on them because they're trying to root out Hamas?
Sure, and we've seen pretty haunting images coming out of Gaza of neighborhoods in ruins, of buildings vaporized by Israeli strikes. The sad truth is, though, that the world has been relatively comfortable with the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank for a very long time. And so it doesn't have the same ability to shock as these images out of the Israeli kibbutzes of entire families slaughtered. But of course we're going to see some of that because, and I hate myself for using this word, but it's part of the battle space now. This is how you win over entire populations. We can bring in the social media use by Ukraine to enormously great effect in terms of building up the solidarity for a besieged people fighting a more powerful aggressor. Everyone is learning this lesson all over again with this conflict, that every side of this dispute is going to want to be winning over, notably Americans, by the way, Americans, but Europeans and China and others. So we're going to see more and more and more via social media. It's hard to throttle, and it's enormously effective from an emotional standpoint. Let me just add one quick thing.
Yeah.
My gratitude to Stephen Cook at the Council on Foreign Relations, who messaged me to say that Iron Dome is actually an Israeli-developed and deployed system, although Raytheon was brought on as a partner in 2012. So many thanks to Stephen for fact-checking me in real time.
And thank you for continuing your reporting in real time as well, Olivier. Really appreciate that. America has, of course, created its own defense systems as well, and has been working on missile defense for quite a while, stationed in Alaska and looking at other places. But this is a uniquely Israeli defense system, and we're seeing images of it even as you look at some of our colleagues who are there reporting from places like Jerusalem. There will be this overhead rocket fire and then the intercept hitting the rockets down. Yeah,
our missile defense has not been called into service nearly as much as Iron Dome has been, and Iron Dome has not been called into service with greater intensity than over the last 72 hours or so. It's been remarkable.
Tolu, before we let you go, as you report on what's happening today, I just want to get a sense from you of what happens next, right? So many questions we're hoping to have answered by this speech by the president shortly this afternoon. But what do the next days look like for him as he tries to continue to deepen and flex these ties with allies and focus the American response?
That's what we're all going to be watching very closely over the next several days. I think the trajectory of this war will be in large part decided over what happens over the next several days, especially as Israel prepares to launch this ground invasion, ground operation into Gaza. I think that it'll be very interesting to see how President Biden reacts to that. We just got imagery of President Biden meeting with his national security team, including the vice president, in the newly renovated Situation Room. This is probably the first time that the Situation Room has been used in this way since it was renovated in this $50 million renovation that we reported on a few weeks back. I think there will be a lot of activity happening in the Situation Room over the next several days as the president watches some of the action on the feeds that the U.S. government has, watches the video feeds, watches the social media, watches how these various situations are being handled, both by Israel, by Hamas, by other nations. I expect there to be multiple calls, round-the-clock activity and discussions and consultation with other partners and allies to try to decide and try to figure out how to manage this. I do think there's going to be a point at which the president has to have a heart-to-heart with Prime Minister Netanyahu and not only voice his support for Israel, but also voice potentially his concerns with how Israel is responding and also offer some guidance about the best way to manage responding to this terrorist attack without doing anything that could lead to more countries getting involved, without doing anything that could lead to more challenges to his legitimacy, both domestically and on the world stage. And so I do think that'll be a key moment to watch. That's something we're going to be reporting on very closely. I don't think it's going to be happening in public. I think it'll be happening behind closed doors, and we'll do our best to report that for the readers and viewers of the Washington Post to get a sense for how the president is handling this, because I do think much of what happens over the next 24, 48, 72 hours will play a major role in how this war unfolds over the next several months.
Just after 2 o'clock here on the East Coast, after 9 p.m. in Jerusalem. Tolu, the president is about an hour late in terms of when we thought he might be coming out. Now, President Biden, the White House sometimes runs on White House time, or I don't know what you call it, Tolu, in the business, if you call it Biden time, as the White House bureau chief. But talk to us about all that could be happening behind the scenes, because we are watching with anticipation to see what the president says. But of course, they're crafting their message, and we know that he did recently get off the phone with the vice president, with Benjamin Netanyahu. So what are the kinds of things happening behind the scenes on a day like this?
The White House Situation Room is buzzing right now, and we'll be trying to get more details and more information on what exactly happened in this meeting. But this meeting included the president's top security officials, including the vice president, including the national security advisor, including a number, the ambassador to the UN, the secretary of state, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff appeared virtually, as did the Defense Department leaders. So I do think that one of the reasons for this delay is because there was a spirited discussion happening in the Situation Room between the president's advisors about what the next step should be, about how to game out the next 3 days, the next 1 week, what the U.S. should be doing, what kinds of packages could the U.S. supply to Israel to support its activities, while also trying to make sure that there is a sense of restraint and that this is being handled in a just and prudent way. And so I do think that's part of the reason why this has taken longer than expected for the president to come out, is he was having a debate and a discussion in the Situation Room with his top advisors and trying to decide what the best things, the next best steps could be. And sometimes those debates are roiling. Sometimes those debates are very spirited, because that you have a lot of very strongly opinionated people, a lot of very smart people who may come down on different sides of the equation on these kinds of debates. And I do think that sometimes those debates tend to take longer than planned, and that's usually a good thing. thing. It means that the democracy is working. But I do think it speaks to how fraught this issue is and how complex and complicated this issue is, that even the president's advisors, even people on his team, could be having disagreements about this and could be trying to figure out the best way to present American strength on the world stage while also navigating a very complex global environment and a very complex diplomatic environment as the president and his aides and allies all sort of handle and manage what is a completely unprecedented situation that no president has found himself in before, in which they are trying to figure out the best way to handle it so that not only does the president speak to the global community, but also make sure that his own political prospects are also kept intact. And so I think that's part of the reason why this discussion has taken as long as it has, and why the president has taken his time coming out before speaking to the American people and speaking to the global audience and the global stage as well.
Tolu Olorunnipa, White House Bureau Chief. Rhonda and Olivier, I mean, Tolu laid the stakes out there so clearly, and obviously better to have your action plan and your strategy right than be hitting a clock. So, Rhonda, what will you be listening for today?
Yeah, that's right. And I just have to say that I'm backing up what Tolu is saying, because I've been sitting here thinking the exact same thing. You know, it's a reporter instinct that if this is running this late, that there are so many complexities, so many balances to strike that they need to discuss before he's in front of the American people. So I think the lateness of this is underscoring that the complexities involved here. At first, I think what I'm listening for is how he addresses the question of the hostages, American hostages that have been taken. I think that's very important to tell the American people the latest on that, even though the details on that may still be developing. That also, too, could be a reason for the lateness as well, trying to figure out, do they give specific numbers? Are they going to find out more later? You know, what do you share with people right now? I'll be listening to that, because even if you think of sort of the history and the politics of it, think about the Iran hostage crisis with Carter and what that did to Carter's presidency. So there are calculations going on here, too. Not that the political calculations should overshadow the human toll and the devastation that's going on, but it is likely that he's got some folks who are paying attention to his campaign strategy in these meetings as well. So I'm listening out for the hostages. Any updates on perhaps the number of Americans who have died? We know they gave a number yesterday. That number may creep up more as details come out. So that is one area that I'm looking at, how he addresses it and when he addresses it. Does he start the speech like that? Is it somewhere in the middle? You know, what tone is he going to put forth here? It really is an important speech if you think of it, and all the ramifications that could come from it. But yeah, it's exactly what Tolu was saying, that reporter instincts are telling us that there's a lot at stake going on right now.
Olivier?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that is correct. I think one of the things that they, frankly, might be fighting over is whether and how to put these attacks in a broader historical context, and whether he includes a line in there about Palestinian grievances, for example. The risk being that some people will accuse him of justifying what happened Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So I
just want to pause you there for a moment. So if he gives the context of what the Palestinian people have endured, that could be seen as that could be seen or perceived as saying that he's somehow justifying.
By some folks. I'm not saying that myself.
Absolutely. I'm just trying to. You have so much information, you deliver so fast. So I want to make sure I'm following. No, it's wonderful. It's rich. It's rich. Thank you.
But you know, the question of whether he
that's a line that you have to weigh that.
Peace down the road. You know, not now, but down the road, we have to address some of these long simmering disputes, something like that. That could be as much of an argument as. Actually, that's more likely to be an argument than let's ship them Iron Dome ammunition right now. In some ways, the immediate and short-term logistics are the easiest things to do here. The support for Israel, the equipping of Israel, the aircraft carrier group that is there as a direct message to countries like Iran and Syria, that stuff is more likely to find a consensus. It gets a lot harder when you get into some of the medium and longer-term issues.
Peace in the Middle East is something that many presidents come into office, many American presidents come into office with the sort of the dream, sometimes the illusion, I guess always thus far, the illusion of being able to have some sort of role in crafting solutions. Can we talk about how this White House has viewed the situation in the Middle East, specifically between the Israelis and Palestinians, and what goals they've had for the region prior to this?
Fairly pessimistic about the prospects for Middle East peace, which is, I will editorialize and say that's pretty realistic. The two-state solution is, I mean, it's charitable. It's on life support. You know, the land for peace formulas, all those things. It's just there's been such a reshuffling in the Middle East towards the threat posed by Iran that it has put the Israeli-Palestinian conflict really on the back burner. The administration has not committed a ton of political capital to advancing I mean, I'm sure they would dispute this if they were in the studio, but they're not, so I'll just say it. They have not expended a ton of political capital on advancing the cause of Middle East peace, except to the degree that they were trying to normalize relations between the Saudis and the Israelis. That would be a diplomatic and political earthquake in the region if it were achieved and achievable. This attack may have been in part motivated by Iran's desire to derail that initiative, and it's hard to imagine a vigorous return to that anytime soon.
I want to bring in Ishan Tharoor, foreign affairs columnist and anchor of Today's Worldview, which is the Post's daily column and newsletter on global politics. Ishan, we're finally seeing this podium shot, so forgive me in advance if I have to interrupt you to go to the president live. But I just want to hear what you're listening for as we await President Biden's speech today.
Right. Well, I mean, I would amplify some of what Olivier just said. It is very easy for an American politician to stand up there and offer his unwavering support for Israel. That's what every American politician does day in, day out. It would be more important down the road to point to what kind of resources the U.S. can muster for a meaningful peace and a political solution to a hideous situation. That is much more circumspect in terms of the rhetoric we see from the White House for anyone in Washington, really. And yes, I mean, some kind of recognition of the deep, kind of problematic and tough context that is shaping this current moment, that I think that would be welcome as well.
What can you tell us about Hamas as an organization and their power in the region, and also whether or not they represent the people of Gaza?
Right, well, Hamas is an Islamist militant group. It's listed as a terror organization by the United States and various European countries. It is a movement that began in Gaza in the 80s at a time when Israel was much more worried about the secular, kind of Soviet-aligned PLO. And so it emerged in a moment at that point and became a big player in the intifadas of the 1990s. Unlike other Palestinian factions, it does not recognize Israel's right to exist. And it has de facto held sway in Gaza since 2007. And because of that, because of its kind of capture of Gaza after a pretty complicated set of politics that we don't need to go into right now, it has essentially run Gaza as its fiefdom and under Israeli blockade.
You know, Olivier was just talking about how Israel and Saudi Arabia were moving towards normalizing relations, Ishan.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what that would mean for the region and what this latest news does to that process?
Well, you know, the Saudis are, of course, heavyweights in the region. They see themselves as the vanguard of the Arab world, the vanguard of the Muslim world, because they're the custodians of the two holiest sites in Islam. And yes, it would be a political earthquake in the sense that it would really show that the region is moving on from a certain set of dynamics that preceded this. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that all these normalization agreements that have happened under the so-called Abraham Accords have been, you know, pretty interesting political business deals between Israel and a clutch of autocratic Arab states. The idea that these deals in and of themselves have any particular bearing on peace in the region, have any real influence on what happens to the Palestinians, we were already skeptical about that. And I think now what we're seeing right now take place in this war is it really shows that all this stuff is a sideshow compared to the actual conflict. And that, you know, an Israeli-Saudi rapprochement would not really change a lot of the underlying issues unless they're properly addressed and directly addressed.
We've been learning more and more details, Ishan, about just what happened on Saturday as Hamas attacked Israeli citizens. They came in by land, air, sea. We even saw some paragliding in. It's shocking news knowing how advanced Israel's surveillance system is. What information do we have about how they were so caught off guard?
I mean, there's a lot more coming out, and we are trying to report this out. It is stunning that there was such a lapse in security and intelligence to create a scenario where hundreds, thousands of Hamas fighters could enter and infiltrate into Israel and carry out, I mean, the really horrifying, barbaric slaughters that we're learning more and more about. We do know that this Israeli government, this far-right Israeli government under Benjamin Netanyahu, has been diverting resources to the West Bank, which is another part of the area, and where they're specifically working hand in fist with an emboldened settler movement in the West Bank that has really inflamed tensions there, led to a security crisis in the West Bank. And so Israel has diverted some of its resources there, and that could be an issue that comes back into the political conversation in Israel, once the dust sort of settles in this current, after the fighting here that we're going to see unfurl across Gaza. But it is really quite incredible. We do know that the Hamas has been planning this for a long time. They operated with a tremendous amount of precision and care in terms of hiding this from potential Israeli intelligence. Gaza is one of the most surveilled places on the planet. It is quite stunning that they could have pulled it off.
What are you watching for in terms of the hostages, Ishan, and how the U.S. needs to respond, or how President Biden may respond to the question of the fate of Americans, and how Israel is responding to the reality of hostages that have been taken by Hamas fighters?
For Israel, it's a very emotional issue. Just a couple of hostages in previous iterations of this conflict have led to a national crisis and mourning. Now we're talking about over 100 hostages. And so it is such a shocking and traumatic state of affairs, especially if Hamas follows through with some of these threats to carry out executions of these hostages in some kind of hideous public fashion. I think it's really the thing we're watching for in the next hours. We do know that some Arab governments that have points of contact with Hamas, if not necessarily tremendous influence with Hamas, the Egyptians, the Qataris, are trying to, through negotiation, create some sort of avenue by which these hostages can get released. We don't know the state of affairs of those discussions, and especially now as hostilities ramp up and as Israel's preparing for an imminent ground offensive into Gaza, one really does wonder what these governments can do to actually safeguard these hostages.
So many questions about what a ground offensive could look like. What questions are in your mind in terms of how Israel could execute that, and what Israeli leadership will have to weigh as they consider that option?
Well, I think they've made it pretty clear that they're in this for the long haul, that they want to fully root out Hamas from Gaza. Now, given that Gaza is, as I said, the most densely packed place on earth, or one of the most, and a very tiny strip of territory with lots of civilians crammed in very tight spaces, I think we're being expected to prepare ourselves for a lot of civilian casualties. And I think the Israelis have already signaled that they don't really want to be criticized for that. So there's going to be a lot of attention on how much damage is being done. There's going to be a lot of attention on the pressures at the Egyptian border, where an increasing stream of Gazans are going to try to flee. The Egyptians themselves do not want to be host to a huge refugee population coming from Gaza. They've rejected proposals in the past to relocate Gazans into the Sinai Peninsula, which abuts Gaza. So we'll see. I think it's a terrifying situation if you are a civilian in Gaza right now. We know of colleagues and reporters and others who live in Gaza who are desperately trying to get out. Israel has embarked on these campaigns previously. It has this very kind of bleak euphemism of mowing the grass, where Hamas does something and then Israel goes in and mows the grass, takes out some leadership, takes out some weapon stores here and there, does some damage. But of course the grass grows back, And Hamas has shown that, no matter the civilian toll exacted, no matter the damage done to Gaza, it seems quite capable of retooling, re-equipping, preparing once more with ever more sophisticated and unorthodox capacities to strike back at Israel. And so the question now is, if Israel is going to be doing something more than mowing the grass, what does that look like? What does that mean for everybody in Gaza? And what does that mean for the whole geographic and geopolitical equation in the region thereafter?
The picture you're painting is so terrifying for the civilians of Gaza. It's also, of course, an alarming series of places our minds can go when we think about what a powder keg that region could be. So can you talk to us, Hashan, about how world leaders are having to look at this as a component in the region and concerns about viability of future stability?
Right. Well, the immediate attention then is to Israel's north, where Lebanon is and where Hezbollah sits. You've already seen clashes over there, and if a ground invasion goes ahead, and it appears as brutal and as systematic as it may be, you will likely see a retaliation from Hezbollah in the north, and so there'll be an expanding arc of conflict across Israel on both sides of its borders. You will also probably see some kind of flaring up of tensions in the West Bank, which has its own militia groups and its own kind of flashpoints and potential spaces for conflict. And then you may see reprisal actions towards Westerners, towards Israelis and other parts of the Arab world, as people who are sympathetic with the Palestinians and feel the perceived injustice of what's happening, take the issue in their own hands. As much as certain Arab governments want to mend fences and bury the hatchet with Israel, public opinion in a lot of these countries is still very much charged against the Israeli state and what it sees as a kind of colonial project against the Palestinians. And so this could inflame a lot of tensions around the world and certainly around the region.
Hashan, stay with us. I want to turn to Olivier for a moment to bring us back to this question of what President Biden has to weigh as he considers all of these dynamics that Hashan is weighing out for us so clearly. How does Biden take all of this into account?
It's a great question. That's why we're about to listen to him, right? Because we want to see what the President of the United States, how he balances the short, the medium, the long term, the need to support Israel, his domestic political challenges in getting aid out the door, to say nothing of having a functioning Congress. This is why we're watching it. We want to see what priorities the president lays out in this speech. What is top of mind for him? It's we've said this now a couple times, but what does he say about the hostage situation, which is really one of the more wrenching and difficult problems right now, as Israel is seemingly gearing up for a ground offensive in the shadow of Hamas's threat to kill some of their hostages if Israel doesn't give prior warnings of airstrikes. So this is the importance of the presidential speech, to lay out the priorities of one of the most powerful players on the world stage in the response to this astonishing, unprecedented crisis. And how he addresses this is what Tolu was talking about earlier, the vigorous conversation among all these different significant stakeholders inside the administration, the defense secretary, the secretary of state, the vice president, the national security advisor, the ambassador of the UN, the CIA director. There's a photo now of President Biden meeting with these folks in the Situation Room, although the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is in Brussels and Defense Secretary Austin was piped in via his plane on his way to Brussels. So that's how they set these priorities. They have this vigorous conversation. At the end of the day, it's the president's job to decide, but he will do so with a lot of input from a lot of these different players, some of whom have been working for him for decades.
And then it falls to Congress to react, Rhonda, and figure out how they're going to proceed and move forward.
Right. Once they have a Speaker of the House and can move forward legislatively. But just to tack on to that, I think what the president also has to do is relay this sense of certainty in the American government. I think you can look at all sorts of polls right now that show that a lot of Americans don't trust the United States government as they used to, don't have confidence in it. We're seeing that in reaction to the Speaker vote in the House. So if he can also lay out what my administration is doing. Also brief people on it too, because many Americans may know some of the nuts and bolts of what happened on Saturday, but they may not know the full scope. They may not know how the president can respond. If he can also update people on basic things, that could also go a long way. We saw when he addressed Americans a few times ahead of the war in Ukraine, he talked about how if the United States would help them out, gas prices might go up. This is what will happen if we are part of something. So it's not the same situation, Ukraine and Israel, but it does show that the president has, at least during this administration, tried to lay out in somewhat transparent terms what he wants to do for the American people when it comes to foreign affairs.
And I'm glad you reminded us of that, Rhonda, because there was this blunt talk we heard from President Biden at the time that then showed to be lived out. There's President Biden, flanked there by the Secretary of State and the Vice President. We'll go live to the White House.
You know, there are moments in this life, and I mean this literally, when the pure, unadulterated evil is unleashed on this world. The people of Israel lived through one such moment this weekend. The bloody hands of the terrorist organization Hamas, a group whose stated purpose for being is to kill Jews. This was an act of sheer evil. More than 1,000 civilians slaughtered, not just killed, slaughtered in Israel. Among them, at least 14 American citizens killed. Parents butchered, using their bodies to try to protect their children. Stomach-turning reports of babies being killed. Entire families slain. Young people massacred while attending a musical festival to celebrate peace. To celebrate peace. Women raped, assaulted, paraded as trophies. Families hid their fear for hours and hours, desperately trying to keep their children quiet to avoid drawing attention. And thousands of wounded, alive but carrying with them the bullet holes and the shrapnel wounds and the memory of what they endured. You all know these traumas never go away. There's still so many families desperately waiting to hear the fate of their loved ones, not knowing if they're alive or dead or hostages. Infants in their mother's arms, grandparents in wheelchairs, Holocaust survivors abducted and held hostage. Hostages whom Hamas has now threatened to execute in violation of every code of human morality. It's abhorrent. The brutality of Hamas, these bloodthirstiness brings to mind the worst rampages of ISIS. This is terrorism. But sadly, for the Jewish people, it's not new. This attack has brought to the surface painful memories and the scars left by a millennia of anti-Semitism and genocide of the Jewish people. So in this moment, we must be crystal clear. We stand with Israel. We stand with Israel. And we will make sure Israel has what it needs to take care of its citizens, defend itself, and respond to this attack. There's no justification for terrorism. There's no excuse. Hamas does not stand for the Palestinian people's right to dignity and self-determination. Its stated purpose is the annihilation of the state of Israel and the murder of Jewish people. They use Palestinian civilians as human shields. Hamas offers nothing but terror and bloodshed with no regard to who pays the price. The loss of innocent life is heartbreaking. Like every nation in the world, Israel has the right to respond, indeed has a duty to respond to these vicious attacks. I just got off the phone with a third call with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I told him, the United States experience what Israel is experiencing, our response will be swift, decisive, and overwhelming. We also discussed how democracies like Israel and the United States are stronger and more secure when we act according to the rule of law. Terrorists purposely target civilians, kill them. We uphold the laws of war, the law of war. It matters. There's a difference. Today, Americans across the country are praying for all those families that have been ripped apart. A lot of us know how it feels. It leaves a black hole in your chest when you lose family. Feeling like you're being sucked in. The anger, the pain, the sense of hopelessness. This is what they mean by a human tragedy, an atrocity on an appalling scale. We're going to continue to stand united, supporting the people of Israel who are suffering unspeakable losses and opposing the hatred and violence of terrorism. My team has been in near constant communication with our Israeli partners and partners all across the region and the world from the moment this crisis began. We're surging additional military assistance, including ammunition and interceptors, to replenish Iron Dome. We're going to make sure that Israel does not run out of these critical assets to defend its cities and its citizens. My administration has consulted closely with Congress throughout this crisis. And when Congress returns, we're going to ask them to take urgent action to fund the national security requirements of our critical partners. This is not about party or politics. This is about the security of our world, the security of the United States of America. We now know that American citizens are among those being held by Hamas. I've directed my team to share intelligence and deploy additional experts from across the United States government to consult with and advise Israeli counterparts on hostage recovery efforts. Because as president, I have no higher priority than the safety of Americans being held hostage around the world. The United States has also enhanced our military force posture in the region to strengthen our deterrence. The Department of Defense has moved the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group to the Eastern Mediterranean and bolstered our fighter aircraft presence. And we stand ready to move in additional assets as needed. Let me say again, to any country, any organization, anyone thinking of taking advantage of this situation, I have one word: don't. Don't. Our hearts may be broken, but our resolve is clear. Yesterday, I also spoke with the leaders of France, Germany, Italy, and UK to discuss the latest developments with our European allies and coordinate our united response. This comes on top of days of steady engagement with partners across the region. We're also taking steps at home. In cities across the United States of America, police departments have stepped up security around centers of Jewish life. The Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Bureau of Investigation are working closely with state and local law enforcement and Jewish community partners to identify and disrupt any domestic threat that could emerge in connection with these horrific attacks. This is a moment for the United States to come together, to grieve with those who are mourning. Let's be real clear. There is no place for hate in America. Not against Jews, not against Muslims, not against anybody. We reject. What we reject is terrorism. We condemn the indiscriminate evil, just as we've always done. That's what America stands for. You know, just over 50 years ago, I was thinking about it this morning, talking to the Secretary of State, the Vice President in my office. Over 50 years ago, as a young senator, I visited Israel for the first time as a newly elected senator. And I had a long, long trip, a meeting with Golda Meir in her office just before the Yom Kippur War. And I guess she could see the consternation on my face as she described what was being faced. They were facing. We walked outside in that that sort of hallway outside her office to have some photos. She looked at me all of a sudden and said, "Would you like to have a photograph?" And so I got up and followed her out. We were standing there silent, looking at the press. She could tell, I guess, I was concerned. She leaned over and whispered to me, she said, "Don't worry, Senator Biden. We have a secret rep in here in Israel." My word is what she said. We have no place else to go. We have no place else to go. For 75 years, Israel has stood as the ultimate guarantor of the security of Jewish people around the world, so that the atrocities of the past could never happen again. And let there be no doubt, the United States has Israel's back. We will make sure the Jewish and democratic state of Israel can defend itself today, tomorrow, as we always have. It's as simple as that. These atrocities have been sickening. We're with Israel. Let's make no mistake. Thank you.
Mr. President, what was your reaction?
Do you freeze the $6 billion, Mr. President?
President Biden affirming that the United States stands with Israel, saying, "Let there be no doubt America has Israel's back." You can see there an image of the briefing room. We have cut from the president's speech to that room. A bit of an abrupt ending in some ways, Olivier and Rhonda, to these remarks the president is giving. He was in the state dining room with that podium underneath the Lincoln portrait, the site where he wanted to make these unequivocal remarks about the support for Israel. And now we'll watch for the briefing room, where we may get some more information about just what we know about the hostages, about the tally of Americans killed in the attack by Hamas. Let me share some of what else we heard from President Biden that stands out. He said, "Hearts may be broken, but our resolve is clear." And he expressed disgust and heartbreak at the attack by Hamas. He said that his highest priority is American hostages. And he also was unequivocal in warning that there should be no repercussions or attacks on U.S. soil. Also, of course, Olivier, alarming but important, where he talks about how police presences are being required, and there is stepped up knowledge and awareness to protect Jewish centers of worship, of learning, and that will be something on the minds of Americans, surely. I'm Libby Casey. We're watching this live from the White House. I'm with Rhonda Colvin, Olivier Knox, as well as some of our other colleagues. Rhonda, let's just get your first impressions of this speech.
Yeah, unequivocal is a good word. That's actually what I had down in my notes, too, that he came out immediately calling it out, saying that he wanted to be crystal clear about the support to Israel. He kind of laid out in macro and micro terms of what the administration has done. He said that they are supplying Israel with ammunition. He talked about the Iron Dome replenishment, and at that micro level talked about local police departments standing ready to take on any sort of attacks or instances that might happen at the local level regarding anti-Semitism. We do know that the second gentleman, that has been one of his agendas as second gentleman, to call out anti-Semitism. Biden also talked about his history when he went to Israel for the first time, trying to show that there is this through line with his awareness of the region. But overall, it was unequivocal. He didn't spend much time going over any one detail. I've timed that speech at about 10 minutes. He came out at 2:24 and ended at 2:34. So there weren't any nitty-gritty details, but of course, there are developing points with this story, and the White House felt that this is what the American people need to know right now.
Olivier.
Death tolls up from at least 11 to at least 14. He did not put a number on the American hostages being held by Hamas. He did have that warning. He didn't say the word Iran, but it was very clear that's what he was talking about. Countries like Iran and Syria, warning any country, any organization thinking of taking advantage of the situation, don't. That was tied into the presence of the Gerald Ford carrier strike group, so that was pretty unmistakable. One interesting thing in his description of his phone call with Netanyahu, I don't want to say urge restraint or overdo it here, but he did say, he did draw a distinction between Hamas, which deliberately targets civilians, and then said that democracies must act according to the rule of law. We uphold the law of war. It matters, which does seem like a message to limit civilian casualties in any operations in Gaza. But otherwise, yes, basically unqualified support for what Israel has to do today and tomorrow, as we always have, is what he told us here. So there are still some pieces to be fleshed out. I don't know who's briefing today, but if it's Jake Sullivan, I guarantee you questions about numbers of the hostages and how the presence of the hostages complicates Israel's plans, or America's plans for that matter. What America has seen in terms of actions by Iran-backed groups elsewhere, like Lebanese Hezbollah. But on balance, he really sketched out the primal horror of this sophisticated surprise attack by Hamas, justified and defended the Israeli response, and described the broader American response, including, as you pointed out, securing what he called centers of Jewish life in America, which might come under threat.
Ishan Tharoor joins us as well. Ishan, what stands out to you from President Biden's remarks, and what questions do you still have?
In terms of the unqualified nature of his support, I was quite struck by his anecdote that he put forward of his time, a half century ago as a young senator, going to Israel and meeting Golda Meir. And of course, what he's summoning and invoking there is the history of the Yom Kippur War. And that was a genuine existential crisis for Israel, where there was the chance that Israel could no longer exist if the Arab armies that were invading had their way. And Golda Meir at the time had told him, we have nowhere else to go. What's interesting is because the Yom Kippur War analogy has been put forward quite a lot in the last couple of days, is that Israel no longer really faces an existential threat. Hamas, for all the evil of what it did, cannot wipe Israel off the map. And the question that I have, and perhaps this is somewhat provocative, is the question now is no longer where do the Israelis go. The question is where do the Gazans go? Because there are 2 million people there who are about to face an offensive that we've not seen, of a scale that we've not seen before. And I think listening to Biden's speech, there was no trace of interest in engaging that question right now.
Which in and of itself, of course, it just yields more questions and can be revealing. Ishan, Olivier pointed out that there was this pivot in the president's remarks where he was talking about the support of Israel, but also reminding the audience that there are rules to war. There's a rule of engagement in war. And that could be seen really in two ways, right? It can be seen in how Hamas has breached that by murdering civilians, by attacking a youth concert, a rave, and then by taking these hostages. But do you also hear it as a bit of a warning to Netanyahu and saying, you have to recognize the boundaries of what the quote unquote way of conducting war should be when it comes to civilians?
I think perhaps the gentlest of warnings. No one is both sidesing the situation. Hamas is recognized by the United States as a terrorist organization. We don't look for Hamas to be a genuine democratic actor in the international system or in the rules-based order, or however we want to put it. But it is striking that a few months ago, this Biden administration was in much more charged language, chastising Netanyahu for undermining democratic order, for attempting to overhaul his country's judiciary and take Israel down a pretty dangerous path. We know this Biden administration really despises some of the far-right ministers in Netanyahu's camp who have emboldened settlers in the West Bank and who are setting about really smashing whatever faint prospect of a two-state solution there could be. This government is really dismantling it as much as they can. And now, of course, in this moment where the U.S. Is compelled to show as much solidarity and unity with the Israeli state, he offered a line there, but I don't think it was the strongest of lines. And I think if you look at Twitter right now, there's a pretty active conversation from the left about how Biden is essentially offering a carte blanche to the Israelis to do what they will in the coming days.
Olivier, I'd like to bring you and Rhonda into the conversation in terms of what voices matter at this moment to President Biden. So Rhonda, let's start with you and talk about who are the foreign allies and friends, as well as people in American politics who might have his ear right now and give him counsel.
Yeah, he did note that he has been on the phone with European allies about this, suggesting that this is a unified response to what happened over the weekend. On the American side, he did note that he has been in touch with Congress. That's what he said. And just if people aren't following the congressional schedule, the Senate is out this week on a pre-planned break that they had for the federal holiday on Monday. Actually, Chuck Schumer, his office just said that he's going to return early from a congressional delegation that he had in China to respond to and get briefings on Israel. So the question of Israel and the congressional response is a big question right now. In terms of the House, President Biden didn't talk about some of the dysfunction that we're seeing over there, but he did say he's been in touch. I do know that members will be briefed tomorrow morning. All members of Congress who attend will be briefed by State Department officials. So even though one side of Congress, one chamber, isn't exactly up and running as usual, there are still government responses going on in terms of briefings and other matters.
And Olivier, talk to us about the president's team, and some of whom, as you and Tolu pointed out, have been with him for a very long time, maybe not 50 years exactly, but have been with it for maybe so. You would know, not because you're old, because you're a wise correspondent. Talk to us about who on his team is involved in foreign affairs, and who are some of the people who have presence in these conversations based on their job title, or based on, we saw there the Vice President, the Secretary of State flanking him, or based on the relationship they have with Biden?
Well, among his tightest relationships are Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who's been with him since he was a staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when Biden was a member of the committee, and then later chair. Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, has likewise been with him for a very, very long time. There are other interesting voices in this circle. The vice president actually has emerged as a fairly regular interlocutor on foreign policy with him. But I would be remiss if I did not highlight the CIA director, Bill Burns, one of the most talented diplomats of his generation, right? A State Department guy for a very long time before he took over the helm at CIA. This administration, more than others, has sent the CIA director overseas to talk to other leaders and other officials and counterparts and the rest of it. He's a very important voice. In terms of the sort of the more global picture, I thought it was really interesting that one of the very first phone calls that President Biden made when the crisis erupted was to the King of Jordan, King Abdullah. Jordan houses very large numbers of Palestinian refugees, and so you can imagine that a situation in which the Israeli-Palestinian conflict flares up anew would be of particular interest to the King of Jordan, concerned as he would be about stability in his own country. That's very important. And then, of course, you have that sort of European consortium that Biden spoke to yesterday, and will probably speak to again, I suspect, more individually than in groups. One thing I'm watching is, does the president reach out to the Saudi Crown Prince? Saudi Arabia's original response to this was to basically justify the attack. Qatar's initial response was basically to justify the attack. Who's reaching out to the Saudis at this point? Not the president, but other members of his administration probably are.
Ishan, as we watch to see the briefing, what questions are in your mind right now that officials will need to be tackling?
Obviously, more details about what the U.S. is doing to support this Israeli incursion, not incursion, offensive. Some clarity on what the Biden administration sees as the way forward in terms of, an end goal with Hamas, and I think a reflection of some of the bigger geopolitical questions that Olivier just brought up. What are our partners, if not allies, in the region doing to help stabilize the situation? And of course, I think in the near term, though, I think it's all going to be about what happens to these hostages, and what Israel needs to achieve the mission that it hopes to achieve.
We heard President Biden speaking earlier and saying the hostages, American hostages around the world, are a top priority for him. Olivier, what does that actually look like, though, in terms of the mechanics in this moment?
At the moment, it means basically offering Israel whatever intelligence resources it wants from the United States, The special operator community in the United States is also being mobilized, not to put boots on the ground, but to help advise the Israelis on hostage retrieval. But it doesn't. There was not a word from President Biden cautioning the Israelis about the fate of the hostages, which I thought was pretty notable as well. Whatever he's saying in private, that did not seem to enter the picture when he was describing the forthcoming Israeli operation. So they're going to.
So in terms of if they are bombing Gaza and attacking Gaza, or in what sense?
In every part of the Israeli response to the attacks. The Israelis had said that basically they were not going to take the fate of the hostages into consideration as they carried out their military operations. So one of the questions I would have is, what are American officials saying privately to their Israeli counterparts? For that matter, not just are they asking, please be careful, which would be a logical thing, but how much. How important, how much the fate of the hostages weighs on the American advice to Israel at this point in time. It's a wrenching problem, and it's only going to get worse as the Israeli response gets more and more muscular.
Let's bring Liz Sly into the conversation, correspondent at large for the Washington Post covering global affairs. She joins us from London at this hour. Liz, what stood out to you from the president's remarks today?
Well, what stood out for me was how much Biden was supporting Israel. He really made it clear that he's supporting Israel. He didn't look past this. He didn't look past maybe possible long-term future for the Palestinians. He didn't talk about regional diplomacy. So it was very much of the moment. It was very much standing with Israel. And then, of course, he was very careful as well to note that the U.S. is sending an aircraft carrier group to the Eastern Mediterranean in support of Israel, which is quite unusual for an event that happens like inside Israeli-Palestinian issues. They've done it before in history for other conflicts, but this is really quite unusual.
Liz, I'm sorry, we'll have to let it go there because we do see.
As you'll know, this morning, President
Biden is getting underway. We'll go live to the
Prime
briefing
Minister
room.
Netanyahu. This was the president's third conversation with him since this crisis began. President Biden and Vice President Harris continue to meet with the National Security Team to receive updates and give direction on next steps. The president held 17 calls and meetings over Saturday, Sunday, and Monday with his National Security Team. The president and the vice president have held more than 36 meetings, briefings, and calls since the attacks on Israel began. The president will continue to be relentless in ensuring that Israel and the Israeli people have what they need in support from the United States to defend themselves in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. As you all know, you just heard directly from the president, and I have the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, here to take any of your questions on this issue.
Thanks, everybody. I'll make a few comments, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. Like many of you, we've watched in horror and anguish the scenes of butchery against innocent civilians at the hands of Hamas terrorists in Israel. And the more we learn, the greater our grief. More than 1,000 men, women, and children were slaughtered in their homes, on their streets, in desert fields, and among them at least 14 Americans. We mourn for all their lives, and we're actively working with Israelis to determine the whereabouts of the missing, including missing American citizens. As the president just said, what we've seen from Hamas these past few days was the same evil and barbarity that we've seen from ISIS. The unspeakable horrors they perpetrated on innocent people, women, children, the elderly, babies. These were the scenes we saw in Iraq and Syria as ISIS rampaged through. As President Biden said, this is not some distant tragedy. The bonds between Israel and America run long and they run deep. And we stand with Israel, not just in these dark days, but at all times. As Corinne just said, the president has been deeply engaged in giving direction to his national security team to take action to support Israel in its hour of need. At his direction, the United States has surged ammunition and interceptors for Iron Dome, and the president spoke with Prime Minister Netanyahu just a little while ago to talk about additional capabilities that Israel will need, and he pledged that American planes will be landing in Israel with those capabilities in the days ahead. And now, at the direction of the president, we are working with Congress to make sure that Israel maintains supply of these critical assets to defend its cities and its citizens, as well as the many U.S. citizens who live, work, and travel in Israel. Also at President Biden's direction, the U.S. military has enhanced its force posture in the region to strengthen our deterrence, including the movement of a carrier strike group into the eastern Mediterranean, and we are prepared to move additional assets as necessary. Let me be clear, we did not move the carrier for Hamas. We moved the carrier to send a clear message of deterrence to other states or non-state actors that might seek to widen this war. The President has also tasked us with engaging in contingency planning for any and all escalation scenarios, and we are now deeply engaged in that planning, and we are consulting with allies and partners as well about all of the potential scenarios that might unfold in the days ahead. Let me repeat what we've now said many times and what the President said just a short while ago, so that everyone, including enemies who are thinking of exploiting the current situation, hear it loud and clear. The United States has always and will always have Israel's back. And to those families undergoing the unfathomable pain of having loved ones missing, our hearts go out to you. We cannot imagine the anguish you must be feeling right now. We know that U.S. citizens are among the missing, and we know that U.S. citizens, as the President just said, are among the hostages. We are working with the Israeli government and with our regional partners on every aspect of the hostage crisis, including sharing intelligence and deploying experts from across the U.S. government to advise the Israeli government and coordinate with them on hostage recovery efforts. As the President just said, there is no higher priority than the safety and well-being of American citizens being held hostage overseas. Over the coming days, we'll continue to stand strongly with Israel to ensure that it is able to defend itself. And my team and I are working with our colleagues across the U.S. government every hour to keep the President updated on the latest developments, to take his direction and put it into action, and we'll continue following his direction to provide Israel and the people of Israel all the support required at this time of need. And with that, I'd be happy to take your questions. Yeah.
Jake, thank you.
We'll do you first and then.
Thank you, Jake.
Yeah, go ahead.
On the American hostages, can you first of all tell us how many are we talking about, several or a dozen hostages, and do you know anything about their condition at all?
We do not know about their condition, and we cannot confirm a precise number of American citizens. We believe that there are 20 or more Americans who at this point are missing, but I want to underscore and stress that does not mean necessarily that there are 20 or more American hostages. Just that is the number who are currently unaccounted for. We will work hour by hour, both to determine whether we can account for any of those Americans or to confirm exactly what the number of Americans are being held hostage, and we will come back to you with that information as soon as we have it. As you know, very sadly and tragically, the number of dead has risen with each passing hour, and that's true of the total number. It's also true of Americans, which has gone up just today from an earlier report this morning of 12, then 13, now 14. So I cannot give you a precise number. I can tell you that number of unaccounted for at this time. That number could change too, but I want to underscore that that is not a statement from me that we have that many hostages. We do not know the number of hostages we have at this time.
And did the President discuss with the Prime Minister the possibility of a ground incursion into Gaza, and also how that might affect the American hostages that are in Gaza that are now confirmed?
I'm not going to get into the operational discussions that the President and the Prime Minister had. That is important for them to be able to keep in a discrete channel between them. What I will tell you is that the President and Prime Minister did discuss how the United States can deploy expertise to help work on the hostage recovery efforts. That is what the United States is in the process of doing right now. Steve.
Under what circumstances would you put American forces on the ground to help out?
At this point, that is not something that is under planning. What we are focused on when we talk about sending experts, it is people who can work on intelligence, who can work on overall planning, who can work on coordination with the Israeli government. We are not currently sending forces to Israel, and I'll leave it at that for now. Yeah.
Has the President spoken to any of the families of the 14 American citizens who were killed?
He has not yet spoken with the families, but the State Department has been in contact with those families, and the President has been making this his highest priority as he receives briefings each day about what we are doing to try to determine both what's happening with the missing and also to ensure that we can secure the bodies of those who have perished and ensure that they get returned to their loved ones.
Are you also reaching out to those whose loved ones may be unaccounted for? One family member of a missing American said that there's been no formal attempt by the U.S. government to update the families.
We have, in fact, updated the families of the unaccounted for Americans that we know of. If there are Americans for some reason who have not yet been reached out to, that will be remedied immediately because Secretary Blinken, President Biden, everybody in the U.S. government is making this the highest priority. So we are in very regular contact with every family who has someone either missing or unaccounted for, and anyone who's not currently on that list for whatever reason, we will take care of that. That is going to be our highest priority. Yeah.
Thanks, Jake. Two quick questions, one for clarity. The Iron Dome replenishment, has it already arrived or is it on its way?
Some of the interceptors have come out of stocks that the U.S. had in country. So those have gone over to the Israelis in short order, and then we will be flowing in additional Iron Dome interceptors so that they have the capabilities they need to sustain their Iron Dome defense systems. We are also looking at other ways that we can help augment their air defense capabilities as well as we look ahead, not just to what's happening now, but to potential contingencies that could unfold.
And then secondly, what can you say about Iran's role in the Hamas attack? And is that one of the actors you were worried about widening the war?
Look, we've said since the beginning that Iran is complicit in this attack in a broad sense because they have provided the lion's share of the funding for the military wing of Hamas. They have provided training, they have provided capabilities, they have provided support, and they have had engagement and contact with Hamas over years and years. And all of that has played a role in contributing to what we have seen. Now, as to the question of whether Iran knew about this attack in advance or helped plan or direct this attack, we do not, as of the moment I'm standing here at the podium, have confirmation of that. We are talking to our Israeli counterparts on a daily basis about this question. We're looking back through our intelligence holdings to see if we have any further information on that. We're looking to acquire further intelligence. And if there's an update to that, I'll share it with you. But as I stand here today, while Iran plays this broad role, sustained, deep, and dark role in providing all of this support and capabilities to Hamas in terms of this particular gruesome attack on October 7th. We don't currently have that information. We will continue to look for it, and if we find it, we will share that with you. Yeah.
Thank you, Jake. Looking back at the last few days, how did Israel miss this attack coming?
That's a question for you to ask the Israeli government. Obviously, the Israeli government has placed a high premium on its intelligence capacity as it relates to Hamas, as it relates to the West Bank, as it relates to Hezbollah. And why it is that they did not have warning from this is not a question that I can answer from this podium.
What about U.S. intelligence? Was there anything in what crosses your desk that would suggest that this was coming?
We did not see anything that suggested an attack of this type was going to unfold any more than the Israelis did.
And in your meeting in the Situation Room today, we saw an image earlier. At some point, undoubtedly in the last few days, the president has seen the images of the dead Israelis. What has been his reaction when shown those images?
I mean, you've seen him now twice. You've heard his voice. And this has been a deeply emotional time for all of us, as I'm sure it is for many people in this room who know people or know people who were killed or who are missing. And all of us have developed close relationships with our Israeli counterparts. President Biden has a decades-long relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he can hear the pain in Prime Minister Netanyahu's voice when he talks to him. I hear the pain of my counterparts when I talk to them. So this is not just about policy or strategy. This is personal for us, and it's personal for the American people with their bonds with the Israeli people. And so President Biden has seen and felt the deep emotional resonance of this, but he has also held the conviction that his job as president is to make sure that he has the clarity of mind and purpose to take the actions necessary so that we are standing with Israel in its hour of need, so that we are working to deter a widening of this conflict, and so we are getting Israel the tools that it requires to defend itself. Yeah.
Thank you, Jake. You just laid out all of the ways that Iran is complicit in this and facilitated it over years of support for Hamas. is that reason enough to refreeze the $6 billion that the U.S. helped unlock for them to get in exchange for the prisoners?
We have not yet had a dollar of that $6 billion spent, and I will leave it at that.
But will you refreeze it based on this activity that you just laid out, all of the ways that they are complicit in this? The administration said that if we see them going in the wrong direction, that we would stop that down. I understand the position that you guys have, that not a dollar of this has been spent. But will you prevent it from getting into their hands to allow them to, do what they do that you just laid out?
Let me just reiterate what I said, because it's unequivocal. Not a dollar of that money has been spent, and I will leave it at that.
Is it being considered?
Yes.
Jacob, if I can ask you, will the U.S. support Israel's military attacks in Gaza for as long as it takes, until the hostages are freed, or until Hamas is destroyed? I guess in simple terms, how much retaliation in Gaza is the U.S. willing to accept?
I don't think of this in terms of retaliation. This is about providing support to Israel as it seeks to defend its territory and deal with an ongoing imminent threat from Hamas terrorists who, as I said before, are acting a heck of a lot like ISIS terrorists in their barbarity and cruelty. That requires going after Hamas terrorist targets in Gaza, because even as we speak, even as I stand here, there could be rockets flying out of Gaza. Going after those sites, that's not retaliation. That's Israel stepping up to defend itself and ensure the safety and security of the Israeli people. And we're going to support them for as long as they need to ensure that Israel is safe and secure. And I can't put a timetable on that.
So to be clear, is the goal the destruction of Hamas, the guarantee that Hamas cannot launch attacks from there, the confirmation that all Americans and Israelis have been secured safely from there? Where do you draw the line? Is there a red line, or where do you draw that line of what you need to accomplish, what they may accomplish?
I'm not standing up here to draw red lines. What I'm standing up here to say is that in its hour of need, as Israel embarks on an operation to try to protect its country, protect the Jewish state of Israel, and to go after the threats that it faces, and also working closely with them hand in hand to try to secure the release and recovery of American and other hostages, we will do all of that. And I'm not here to draw red lines or issue warnings or give lectures to anybody. I'm here to say that the president has given us direction to take a series of actions. We are undertaking those actions, and we will continue to do so in the weeks ahead.
Last one, very quickly, that we heard from the families of Americans who are unaccounted for right now. They spoke publicly in Israel today. You said the president hasn't spoken to them directly. What is the president's message to those families right now who said it is the responsibility of the president of the United States to make sure their loved ones come home safely?
The president said in his remarks today that as president of the United States, he has no higher priority than the safety and well-being of Americans held hostage overseas. And he has proven in country after country his willingness to go further than any other president has gone before to secure the release and bring those people home. He is going to try to do that in this case as well, but that is a high priority for him, and that is the message that he is sending, along with a deep sense of understanding of the grief and hurt and pain and anguish they are feeling right now as they wait to hear news of their loved ones. Yeah.
Jake, the president has remarks today referred to seeking for assistance for partners, plural. Does that suggest that you've decided strategically to ask Congress for a package that includes both Ukraine aid as well as aid for Israel? And, Chairman McCall suggested even including border and Taiwan money and that. I'm just kind of hoping you could give a state of play of how you guys are thinking about this in your interactions with the Hill.
So I'm not going to get ahead of the president's request and not going to take the place of the OMB director who will present the request that we send up. But the president was very clear today that we will be making a request to the Congress, and it will include a request for funding for support to Israel. And he has also been equally clear that we are going to renew our request to the Congress for aid to Ukraine. What exact form that all takes, that will be worked out and presented by others, not by me. But the notion that we're going to go up and ask for Israel aid and ask for Ukraine aid, that's unequivocal. We are going to do that.
Beyond Iron Dome and ammunition, were there any other requests made by Prime Minister Netanyahu today that we can expect to be part of that package?
As I mentioned in my opening comments, he did make specific requests with respect to other capabilities. I'm not going to get into the details of that from this podium, but he and the President discussed that. I spoke with Lloyd Austin, who was on his way to the NATO Defense Ministerial, about those requests. Secretary Austin is following up on that. And as I said in my opening comments, you can expect to see American planes flying into Israel to deliver military capabilities to support Israel. Yeah.
Just to follow up on Iron Dome, how effective has it been in deterring the attacks? And I know you mentioned this a bit in terms of the interceptors, but has Israel asked for interceptors on an ongoing basis in light of the situation?
You ask how effective it has been in deterring. I can't say that it is deterred, obviously, because a huge number of rockets have fired, but it has been effective, as it typically is, in taking a lot of those rockets out of the sky and saving countless lives by doing so. Now, of course, some rockets have gotten through to tragic cost, and that has been the pattern we have seen in previous conflicts as well. Now, Israel will have an ongoing need for interceptors, because an air defense system is only as good as your ability to continue to put interceptors in that can take out the rockets that are coming to kill civilians and rain down terror on cities. And we are committed to making sure that we are working with Israel to produce and supply the requisite number of Iron Dome interceptors so that they can keep those systems going on an indefinite basis going forward, because we cannot say how long this will be going on. Yeah.
Thank you. Jake, while you support Israel militarily and rightly denounce this horrific and heinous act against Israeli civilians, how can you make sure that Israel goes after Hamas and its infrastructure in Gaza, not 2 million Palestinians who are trapped with no water, with no electricity, with no medical supply? The UN schools are overflown now. The number of dead is reaching 850 so far, including 6 members of one family of the former ambassador to Washington. How can you make sure that this is not revenge, but actually going after Hamas, who committed this horrible crime?
Well, as the President said today, the difference between countries like the United States and Israel is that we do not deliberately target civilians. We are strongest when we are committed to the rule of law, and we work to make sure that all military operations are conducted consistent with the rule of law and the law of war. That is something that President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu have discussed, not just in this context, but in previous contexts as well. That is something the United States has always stood for and always will continue to stand for. Yeah.
Sorry, can you confirm that the Egyptian intelligence has passed information to the Israelis that the attack is imminent, or some attack is going to happen?
I cannot confirm that. Yeah.
Prime Minister Netanyahu tweeted on Saturday telling residents of Gaza to leave now because we will operate forcefully everywhere. Where is the idea of where people in Gaza will go?
This is something also that we have been discussing with our counterparts in Israel and with our counterparts in Egypt. And without getting into the specifics of safe passage for civilians and so forth, I will say it's something that the U.S. government is seized with in supporting how we do that operationally. But the details of that are something that are being discussed among the operational agencies, and I don't want to share too much of that publicly at this time.
Imminently, or what is the...
I'll leave it at the fact that we are focused on this question. There are consultations ongoing, and I'll share more when I have an update for you. Yeah.
Following up on that question about what the president said about talking to the Israeli prime minister about democracies and the laws of war, was that a warning to the prime minister, and why did the president feel that was necessary to bring that up in the call today?
It was not a warning. The call today was not President Biden warning Prime Minister Netanyahu about anything. It was two leaders talking to one another, one who is leading a nation that has suffered an unfathomable attack, and another nation who is standing behind them foursquare in the defense of their country. And the conversation carried on in those terms, and the two leaders spoke in a collaborative fashion, as they always do. No, I cannot accept the characterization of your question. Yeah.
Thanks, Jake. I have two questions. First, some reports are saying that IRGC commander was in Lebanon. Ismail Khani was in Lebanon a few days ago, and he left to Syria. Also, you are saying that Iran is complicit in this attack. Are you trying to downplay the Iranian role here? What are you waiting for to take an action? And my second question, what assessment do you have on where other Iranian militias stand now, whether in Iraq? We also heard the Houthis threat now. Can you give us an update? And is there a risk on the U.S. troops in the region? Thank you.
So on your first question, I laid out our view, which is the broad complicity based on the long-standing support that Hamas is giving to Iran. We don't have specific information that ties Iran to this attack. At this time, we don't have that information. We may gain that information in the hours and days ahead, but we don't presently have it. So that's in answer to your first question with respect to the intelligence. With respect to the question of the various militia groups across the region, we do believe that they pose an urgent threat and that it is certainly distinctly possible that they choose to try to exploit or take advantage of this situation. And we have been sending clear warnings that doing so will result in a firm response and consequences from the United States. And that goes across the board. And we have been clear also in sending a message of deterrence through the movement of the Carrier Strike Group into the Eastern Mediterranean, as well as through the assurance that we will sustain F-16s, F-35s, A-10s in theater to be able to deal with any contingency that the United States might have to deal with in the days ahead. Yeah.
Thanks, Jake. The European Union says it opposes a total siege of Gaza. What's the U.S. position on that?
I have seen those reports, but my understanding is that is not the concept of siege is not something that, in fact, is going to be pursued by the Israeli government. But we are consulting with the Israeli government about their actions in this regard. And like I said before to a previous question, President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu had the opportunity to talk through the difference between going full bore against Hamas terrorists and how we distinguish between terrorists and innocent civilians. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jake. Just zooming out to China, is the U.S. worried that this attention now to Israel is going to detract resources from the Indo-Pacific? Have you communicated with Beijing about this attack in Israel? And just going to Senator Schumer's comments, he said he was disappointed by President Xi's soft response. Has that been part of the discussions here?
We were not entirely surprised by the PRC's response based on their history of commentary on these kinds of issues. We believe that the United States is capable of supporting Ukraine in Europe, of supporting our allies in the Indo-Pacific, and of supporting our close ally Israel in its hour of need. And we believe we have the resources, tools, and capacities to be able to effectively do that. And part of our job is to ensure that we are working across all of these theaters at once, and that's precisely what we're doing each day. Yeah.
There have been some Republican lawmakers who have argued the U.S. can't support two wars. Could you address some of that and talk a little bit about how you'll make these requests to Congress and make the case that the U.S. needs to invest, maybe not with troops on the ground, but with military and economic aid in both Israel and Ukraine?
Standing for Ukraine so that Russian aggression does not prevail in Europe, the amount of resources that we need to put into that compared to the amount of resources we would have to put in if Russia were, in fact, to conquer Ukraine and then potentially have its aggression continue across Europe, it is so much more cost-effective to take the action now as opposed to pay the huge price later, a price that might ultimately, as it has in the past, require the actual deployment of American troops to combat. So better to support the Ukrainians as they stand firm against Russian aggression and do so on a sustained basis. And we have the budget wherewithal to be able to do that. We also have the budget wherewithal to be able to provide Israel what it needs. And we firmly reject the notion that the United States of America cannot at once support the freedom-loving people of Ukraine and support the state of Israel. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Jake. Is the administration working with Israel and Egypt to open the Rafah crossing to try to ensure evacuations are possible? And then also, I know that you said that in conversations with Israeli leaders, you don't think that a complete siege is something that they may be attempting to do in Gaza, but is there any counsel of restraint from the administration to Israel?
So on the first question, in reference to a previous question, I spoke about our consultations with the Israelis and the Egyptians about how to deal with the challenge of civilians who want to leave Gaza. I'm not going to get into the details of that, about a specific crossing or so forth, only to say that that is something we are focused on and we are working on, and I want to leave those conversations in diplomatic channels, at least for the moment. When we have more to offer on that, I'll be sure that we do so. And then we are having conversations with the Israelis, as I have described, and again, at this podium, I'm not going to go into details on them in terms of what precise messages we're passing. It's important that we be able to talk to the Israelis in the way that we always do, as good friends, as honest friends, and we will continue to do that. Yeah.
Thanks, Jake. So on the home front, over 150 people who are on the terrorist watch list have been seized along the southern border this fiscal year, and we've reported that there's been over 1.5 million known gotaways since the Biden administration took office. Is this something the American people should be worried about right now?
We continue to remain vigilant about terrorist threats to the homeland from anywhere. It is something that we are very much working on, that we are consulting with the Congress on, that we are seeking to secure the necessary resources to continue to work through. And anytime we see any threat stream involving a terrorist threat to the homeland, we mobilize every asset and resource of the U.S. government to go after that. And that includes information and analysis that we have shared with the Congress about plots emanating from the Middle East, plots emanating from other places. We'll continue to do that. We also will continue to take steps to pursue a humane, orderly border policy, and we will work with the Congress in the weeks ahead to continue to get the resources we need to be able to do that. I would point out that in the last supplemental, we actually sought additional funding for the border, which was not forthcoming in the ultimate package that went through. So the Biden administration has said to Congress already, we're looking for more resources to be able to deal with the continuing challenges that we have at the border. Yeah.
Jake, the president doesn't have a confirmed ambassador to Israel at this point. What are you doing to get Jack Lew confirmed, given he was nominated about a month ago? The nomination was sent to the Senate in late September. What's the plan to get him on the ground?
Well, first, the Senate is coming back into session next week. Second, when they do, we are going to work with both Democrats and Republicans, and particularly the leaders on both sides and the chair and ranking of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to make that happen as soon as humanly possible, and then get him out to the region immediately thereafter.
Is that your top priority when Congress returns, apart from the aid requests that you're talking about?
Well, it's hard to answer top priority in the sense that our top priority when Congress comes back is going to be the full spectrum of needs that Israel has. Some of that is related to the support that we're seeking from Congress, and then, of course, having high-level diplomatic representation is going to be critical as well. So we will move urgently on that the minute that they come back. Yeah.
One of the things earlier, I'm sorry, can you just clarify your answer?
Sorry, it's the...
Just one question. Can you just give us where things stand with the normalization deal? Is that on hold now? Is there any progress? Or do you see any progress with that?
So we are right now focused on dealing with the immediate challenge that we are confronting and that Israel is confronting. And so I'm not going to give a characterization on the state of play on normalization. It's not on hold. But obviously over the last 4 days, all of our attention with respect to our support for Israel has been focused squarely on this conflict, on this heinous, brutal attack, and on helping Israel be able to defend itself. We're going to continue to try to do that.
Can you just clarify your answer, your yes?
You and the president have both compared Hamas to ISIS. What does that say about the U.S. approach to Hamas going forward?
Well, we have labeled Hamas a terrorist group for years, if not decades. And we have consistently supported Israel in its efforts to fight back against and undermine Hamas, and we will continue to do so. In the immediate term, what it means is working with Israel to ensure that they are able to go after that Hamas threat in Gaza effectively, relentlessly, and to the point where they feel that their security and their deterrence has been fully restored. Yeah.
Sullivan, can I just ask real quick? I'm sorry. Mr. Sullivan, are you concerned at all that those who are here in the U.S., terrorists who are here in the U.S., may be emboldened by what's happening now And just to piggyback on what was asked earlier, because we do know that there are people sort of lurking here, is there a concern that there may be a flare-up?
The president put out a written statement yesterday with multiple elements to it. One of those elements was about the focus that we have right now on protecting Americans here at home against anyone who would seek to exploit or piggyback on what has unfolded, these gruesome events that have unfolded in Israel. Part of that is about protecting places of worship, synagogues, and ensuring that we don't see a kind of virulent form of anti-Semitism sparked by what has just happened. And then part of that is about ensuring that any terrorist threat here in the United States or to the United States or to Americans anywhere in the world, that we are at a heightened state of vigilance to deal with that. That's something the president directed his team. It's something he spoke to yesterday in that statement, and it's something that he will be convening his national security team on this week because it remains a very high priority. And I'll take the last question.
Does the administration regret making the prisoner swap with Iran in light of these attacks?
The United States does not regret bringing home American citizens who have been unjustly detained abroad. As I said before, the president has no higher priority than to get Americans home. Right now, we have Americans who are being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. That is a high priority. Bringing those Americans home from Iran was a high priority, from Afghanistan, from Venezuela, from other places as well. And we stand by bringing those people home because that is the duty of the commander-in-chief. Is to get innocent Americans out of captivity in places that they are being unjustly detained. Thanks.
Jake, if Israel strikes Iran, what level of support can they count on from the U.S.?
Thanks, Jake. Okay, I know the president's going to have an event shortly, and the pool's going to have to gather. So we'll take a few questions. Go ahead, my friend. Go ahead.
Hi, Karine. On the special counsel interviews, did the president answer all the questions that were asked during the interviews, and was executive privilege invoked at any time? I know there's limits on what you can say, but any transparency would be helpful on this.
So look, my colleague at the White House Counsel put out a statement yesterday, providing an update of where we are with this particular interview and the special counsel. Obviously, I'm just not going to go beyond what my colleague has shared. If you have any further questions, certainly I would refer you to the Department of Justice or the White House Counsel to ask any detailed information.
All right. Okay. For the record, though, we understand the president's interview with Special Counsel Robert Hur was scheduled long before the conflict began. At least that's what we're being told by people here at the White House and elsewhere. Did the president and his legal team ever ask for the interview to be rescheduled, given what transpired in Israel over the weekend?
So again, Ed, I'm not going to go beyond the statement from the White House counsel, and you all know and have seen for yourself, the president spoke this is the second time he's spoken about Israel in the last couple of days, so we know how focused he's been on what has happened. He's shown his leadership over the horrific events over the weekend in Israel. And look, we disclosed the interview. We put that out in a statement from the White House counsel for my colleague at the White House counsel. And the president is obviously was intensely engaged. He spoke to many of our allies, whether the King of Jordan, the leaders of Italy, France, Germany, and the UK. He met, and as I said at the top, he met with our national security team over a dozen times. And he spoke with Bibi, Prime Minister Netanyahu, to be more precise, the third time today, so twice over the weekend. So he's been very much focused on the issues of the horrific events that we have seen in Israel. The president is able to do multiple things at once. Right? As president, he has to do multiple things at once, and that's what you saw him do this weekend.
And did the president's need to be interviewed by the special counsel yesterday impede or keep him from giving the remarks he gave yesterday? Because the press office certainly knows there was a lot of inquiry and concern and criticism that perhaps he was not as publicly engaged yesterday as he possibly could have been. It was a federal holiday. There was some respect or decision made to not hold public events on the federal holiday, but clearly he was doing a big thing by meeting with the special counsel. So was there any reason to believe that that impeded his ability to respond publicly to what was going on in the Middle East?
Well, as you just said, Ed, presidents have to do multiple things at once. He spoke on Saturday, right? When we learned, when all of you were reporting and it was incoming of what was happening in Israel. He spoke today, obviously. There were multiple statements from this president. I just mentioned he met with his national security team dozens of times. He did multiple calls with heads of states to trying to make sure that we got the support, continued that support, organized the support of other allies and partners across the world. And we put out a statement as well, a joint statement from those allies and partners. Look, the president was very much engaged in showing his leadership and also how we're going to continue to support Israel, and that's going to that's how we're going to move forward. And again, the president has to handle many things at once, and we saw him do that over the past couple of days, since Saturday.
The president said that he will urge Congress to act quickly on Israel aid. Obviously, Ukraine aid is also still outstanding. Is there a preferred pathway forward from this White House on how both of those things can happen, given the situation on Capitol Hill right now?
Look, Jake Sullivan spoke to this a little bit about when he was asked about the aid. Look, and he said this, he said it much better than I'm about to say, which is how important it is to continue to support Ukraine in their time of as they are fighting for freedom, as they're fighting the aggression from Russia. It is important that we continue to do that because, look, doing that now, the cost benefit of it now, is so important to do it now than to allow Putin, a dictator like Putin, to continue beyond Ukraine, right? It is important that we continue to focus on making sure that Ukraine has everything that they need as they bravely fighting for their freedom and for their democracy. And we're going to continue to certainly move forward, as you heard with the president, to ask Congress when they get back for additional assistance. Both of those things are incredibly important. Both of those things need to move forward. Both of the things, as Jake said, we are able and can do as the United States. I'm not going to talk about our strategy. We're going to certainly, as Jake said, the OMB director is going to lay that out. We're going to figure out the best path forward. I'm just not going to get into details on how that's going to look from now.
Have White House officials had any conversations with lawmakers about potentially speeding up the House speakership race?
Not going to get involved in the House speakership race. That is something, again, as I've said many times, as we have said many times, the House, as you know, is the majority goes to the Republicans. It is their path, it is their process to figure out who is going to be the speaker. Certainly, we want that to get done so that we can move forward with the business of the American people. But I'm not going to get into the congressional process from here. I'm trying to see who has not. Go ahead, Garrett. I know you haven't gotten called on.
There have been some clashes across the country in demonstrations amongst protesters in the aftermath of amid what's happening in Israel. How concerned is the administration that these clashes could turn violent, and do you have a message for demonstrators more broadly?
So look, I mean, Jake also spoke to our focus and the importance of making sure that the Jewish community here is protected, making sure that there aren't acts of violence. We're always going to denounce any act of violence against any community, and certainly going to continue to show our support and going to be vigilant on that. Don't have anything else to go beyond that, but we are certainly monitoring, keeping an eye on all of this, and we're going to continue to support the community here. Yeah. We have to start. Go ahead, Phil.
What is the president's message to...
Okay, the pool should start leaving, and then we're going to take this last question.
Thank you, Green. What is the president's message to members of Congress who seem to be equating the Hamas terror attack with actions that were previously taken by Israel?
Say that one more time. Everybody's moving around. I apologize.
What is the president's message to members of Congress who seem to be equating the Hamas terror attack with actions that were previously taken by Israel?
Look, here's the thing, and which congressional members?
Well, there have been some members of Congress who have called for a ceasefire, and they have not gone as far as backing the administration's call for support for Israel.
So look, I've seen some of those statements this weekend, and we're going to continue to be very clear. We believe they're wrong. We believe they're repugnant, and we believe they're disgraceful. Our condemnation belongs squarely with terrorists who have brutally murdered, raped, kidnapped hundreds of Israelis. There can be no equivocation about that. There are not two sides here. There are not two sides. President Biden has been clear on where he has stood. You heard from him directly today. You heard from him also on Saturday on this. There's been multiple statements from this president, and he's taking action to provide additional support to ensure that Israel has what they need to defend themselves.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Go ahead. And then last question, and then we'll be back tomorrow.
Yesterday, the president said he was putting police departments on high alert. Can you guarantee that members of the Muslim diaspora or immigrant communities can still feel safe, can still exercise their civil liberties and exercise their criticism of Israel's behavior? Was that part of the conversations, and can you assure those communities that they still have all the rights?
I don't have any details of the conversation, but obviously the president is going to be, we're always going to denounce any type of violence, and certainly to keep communities safe, that is something we'll be vigilant about. I don't have anything else to add. Thank you so much. We'll see you guys tomorrow.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.